The dart left the emitter at 1100 meters a second, and Wren Ashby caught it between two fingers, a hand's width from her own eye. She did not flinch. She had not stood. She sat in the restraint chair exactly as they had positioned her, spine loose, wrists open on the armrests where the cuffs had been left unlatched because the physicians believed still that they were the ones deciding what happened in this room. The dart was a slim ceramic needle the length of a finger bone, tipped with a marker die meant to paint the point of a failed reflex across her cheek. It had not reached her cheek. It sat pinched in her grip, quivering with the momentum it had nowhere left to spend, and a single bead of the die welled at its tip and dropped to the white floor. Across the chamber, junior physician Kessler made a sound the translation collar rendered as a swallowed word. "N," said the one they called Prime. Asan Vale stood at the observation rail with all four hands folded, 2 over 2, the posture the veyd used to signal that nothing unusual was occurring. His skin was the pale gray of wet stone, and the light from the dome above him passed through the thin webbing between his upper arms so that he seemed at the edges slightly translucent. Reset the emitter. Increase to 1400. She anticipated the discharge cycle. We are measuring reflex, not prediction. Prime, the discharge cycle is randomized. Kessler's voice had gone careful. There is no pattern to anticipate. Then she anticipated nothing, and we recorded a lucky closure. Increase to 1400. Wren set the dart down on the armrest. She lined it up parallel to the edge, the way a person tidies a fork, and she folded her hands again and waited. Her hair was the flat brown of river mud, cut short and uneven because 8 days ago a med tech had shaved a strip of it to seat a sensor, and no one had offered to fix the rest. There was a healing scratch along her jaw. There was gray station dust ground into the creases of her knuckles. She was 19 years old and 1 meter and 6 centimeters shorter than the shortest veyd in the room, and she looked, in the restraint chair, like a child left in a place too large and too cold for children. The emitter cycled up. Wren heard it, the fine ascending whine as the coils drank power, and she let herself hear it the way she had learned to let herself hear everything since the graft, which was to say without hurry, each sound arriving with a little room around it. 1400, Talith reported from the instrument bank. The second physician kept 2 of his hands moving over the console and 2 pressed flat against his own thorax, an anxious gesture. Charge nominal, ready on your mark. Mark, said Vale. The dart came faster than the first. It also came at her throat this time, not her cheek, which Wren noted and did not remark upon. She caught it. She had, from the moment the whine began, understood roughly where it would go, because a person who has been caught in enough failing places learns that, when the frightened thing changes its aim, it aims for the throat. She caught it and held it up so the observation rail could see, and then she set it down beside the first, parallel tidy. 2 darts on the armrest, a neat little pair. The chamber was very quiet. The dome overhead let in the hard white light of the system star, filtered to a clinical flatness, and the light lay across the floor and the instruments and the pale skins of the physicians without warming any of it. This was the augmentation ward of the research station Vest Deep, and everything in it had been built to be cleaned. The walls curved. The seams were sealed. There were drains in the floor. The reflex index, Talith said and stopped. Read it, Vale said. The reflex index has no reading, Prime. The scale terminates at a conduction value of 900. We calibrated it for the theoretical ceiling of an augmented deathworld subject, which the modeling placed at 640. Her closures are registering above the ceiling of the instrument. The instrument is reporting a fault because it does not believe the number. For a moment no one moved. Then Vale unfolded his hands and refolded them the other way, upper over lower, and Wren watched him do it and understood that she had just made the calmest creature in the room afraid, and that he did not yet know it showed. Recalibrate the instrument, Vale said. Extend the scale to 2000. We will find her ceiling today. They had taken her from a transit hold above the Halcyon Drift 9 weeks ago, along with 40 other people the manifest called attrition grade 9 biologicals, salvage eligible. Wren had not fully understood the phrase then. She understood it now. Attrition grade 9 was the veyd designation for a world that killed its own inhabitants at a rate the veyd found difficult to believe and impossible to survive as tourists. A sundering world in the older catalogs, a place where the gravity and the weather and the animals and the diseases and the other people all worked together, generation after generation, to select for a creature that did not die easily and did not stop when hurt. The veyd had a great many such catalogs. They had studied Earth for a long time from a comfortable distance, the way one studies a fire, and they had concluded that the most valuable thing a sundering world produced was not its metals or its water but its survivors, and that a survivor, properly modified, might be made into an instrument. The augmentation ward was where they made the instruments. Of the 41 people taken from the Halcyon transit hold, 11 had been rejected at intake for reasons Wren was not told. Of the 30 who remained, the graft had killed 9 outright and broken 6 others into things that could not be sold, and those Wren did not think about, because thinking about them did nothing, and she had learned young not to spend herself on things that did nothing. That left 15 human beings in the compliance tier, in individual white cells with drains in the floors, each one being tuned toward a buyer. Wren had been told, in the flat, pleasant voice the physicians used for everything, that she was responding to the conduction graft better than any subject in the ward's history, and that this was very good news for her, and that she should be grateful, because a responsive asset was a living asset and an unresponsive one was salvage. She had said thank you. She had learned that too. The scale is extended, Talith said. 2000, emitter reset. Prime, shall I reduce the projectile mass? At these velocities a ceramic needle may. Maintain the projectile. Increase velocity to the emitter's mechanical limit. Kessler turned from the console. The junior physician was smaller than the other two, younger in some way Wren could not name precisely but recognized, and Kessler's 4 hands had stopped pretending to work. Prime, the emitter's mechanical limit is above the speed of sound in this atmosphere. We would be discharging a supersonic round at a restrained subject at a range of 4 meters. If her closure fails, it is not a die mark. It is a penetrating injury to a subject we have spent a fortune tuning. Her closure will not fail, Vale said, because I wish to know what does not fail. That is the entire purpose of this ward. Charge the emitter. Wren spoke for the first time since they had walked her in. You should move, Kessler, she said. The translation collar carried her voice out flat and quiet into the chamber. She had a low voice, a little rough, the voice of someone who did not use it much. Every veyd in the room went still at the sound of it, because subjects in the compliance tier did not offer instructions. Explain the statement, Vale said. Kessler is standing on the emitter's axis, Wren said. Behind me. If I catch the round, it stops. If I miss the round, it goes through the headrest and then through Kessler. You've moved the emitter to my throat, which means the shot line runs level, which means it runs into the console bank where Kessler is standing. So you should move Kessler or move the emitter before you charge it. I'm only telling you because Kessler said the thing about the injury and no one listened, and someone should. She said it the way a person reads a gauge aloud. There was no plea in it and no threat in it. It was information, offered because it was true, and the offering of it changed the temperature of the room more than the 2 darts had. Vale looked at the shot line. He looked at Kessler, who had gone the color of ash. He looked at Wren, who was looking at nothing in particular, her hands folded, waiting. Kessler, Vale said, step off the axis. Kessler stepped off the axis. Charge the emitter. The whine began, and this time it climbed past the place where the earlier shots had fired, up into a register that made Talith flatten all 4 hands to his thorax, and Kessler gripped the edge of the console. Wren closed her eyes. She did not need them for this. That was one of the things she had discovered in the 9 days since the graft settled, that the seeing had gotten so fast it outran the eyes, that the world arrived through the skin and the small hairs and the shift of pressure before the light did, and that if she wanted the world to slow down, she only had to stop insisting on watching it. She let the wine climb. She let it fill the room. She let it reach the top of its ladder, and she felt, in the pressure against the drum of her ear, the exact hollow instant when the charge tipped over into release. The round left the emitter faster than the sound of its own firing. She caught it. There was no drama in the catching. There was a sound, a single hard tick, like a stone dropped on tile, and then Wren was sitting exactly as she had been, eyes open now, with a length of glowing ceramic pinched between 2 fingers a hand's width from her throat, and the friction of stopping it had scorched a thin brown line across the pads of her fingers that she did not appear to feel. The round hissed. She turned her wrist and looked at it the way one looks at a splinter, and then she leaned forward. The cuffs were unlatched. They had always been unlatched, and she set it down on the armrest beside the 2 darts. 3 articles, parallel tidy. The catch registered at 1840, Talith whispered. On the extended scale, it is not a fault, it is a reading. Veyd did not order another shot. He stood at the rail with his 4 hands folded, and he studied the small brown-haired creature in the chair the way a man studies a door he has just realized was never locked, and Wren studied him back, and the star burned white and cold through the dome above them both. "Return her to the tier," Veyd said at last. "We are finished for the day." They were not finished. Wren knew they were not finished. The way you know a storm is not finished when the first band passes, and the light turns a strange flat yellow, and the birds go quiet. But she stood when the handlers came for her, and she let them clamp the walking restraints to her wrists, and she walked out of the chamber between 2 enormous escort-cast Veyd whose sidearms she could have taken from their holsters in the time it took them to blink, if taking sidearms were the kind of thing she did. It was not. That was the part they had not measured yet. The compliance tier was a curved white corridor with 15 doors, and behind 14 of them were 14 people she had never been allowed to see and had come to know entirely through sound. There was a man 3 doors down who prayed in a language she didn't recognize, the same 9 phrases, morning and night, and had done so every day for 9 weeks without missing once, and Wren had come to set her own day by him. There was a woman across the corridor who wept for exactly the first hour after the lights dimmed and then stopped, cleanly, as though she had a ration of grief and spent it and would not go into debt. There was a child. The child was 4 doors up, and the child was not human. That had confused Wren for the first week, until she understood. The child was a small thing of a species she'd learned was called the Renew, a slight, feathered, hollow-boned people from a low-gravity world, timid and quick, of no use to anyone as an instrument. The child had been swept up in the same salvage lot as the humans by an error in a manifest, catalogued as attrition-grade biological, delivered to a ward that had no idea what to do with it and no procedure for sending it back. His name was Ilo. He was, by the physician's own estimate, 6 years old. He had been in the cell 4 doors up for 9 weeks, and every night after the woman finished her hour of weeping, Ilo cried the thin, exhausted cry of a small creature that has run entirely out of the strength to be brave. And every night Wren had lain in the dark of her own cell and listened to it and been able to do nothing at all. That was the thing she thought about, walking back between the escorts with a scorched line burned across her fingertips, not the round she had caught. Not the number on the extended scale. Ilo, crying 4 doors up, and the fact that she was now, as of this afternoon, fast enough to cross a room before the light of it reached anyone's eyes, and that this speed the Veyd had put into her had been purchased and installed for one purpose only, which was to make her a better thing for hurting people, and that they had not once, in all their measuring, asked what she intended to do with it. They put her in her cell. The door sealed with the soft chumming sound the seals made, The light dimmed to the amber they called rest cycle. Down the corridor the man began his evening prayer, 9 phrases. Ren lay on the shelf that served as a bed and listened to them, and she flexed her fingers against the sting of the burn, and she began, quietly and without any heat at all, to think. Prime Asan Vale did not return to his quarters that evening. He went instead to the analysis vault below the ward, where the day's telemetry hung in the air as slow-turning columns of veyd script, and he stood among the columns and read them for a long time. He was not a cruel man. He would have said this of himself and believed it, and by the standards of his caste it was even true. The veyd did not augment deathworlders out of malice. They did it out of a deep and ancient fear, and out of the logic that fear builds. The galaxy the veyd lived in was crowded and old and full of peoples who had learned long ago that the shortest road to security was to hold the leash of something more dangerous than your neighbor held. The veyd were physicians and scholars, soft-bodied and slow, and they had survived among harder peoples for 9,000 years by being the ones who could take a dangerous thing and make it obedient. That was their trade. That was their leash craft. And when they had found, out at the edge of the surveyed volume, a world that produced dangerous things by the billion, cheap, plentiful, and utterly disposable, they had understood it as a merchant understands a mine. The subject in the compliance tier was, by every measure the vault could display, the finest article the ward had ever produced. Vale read the columns and felt the specific pleasure of a craftsman looking at his best work. And then he reached the closure telemetry from the final shot, and the pleasure cooled and became something else. The instrument had recorded not only the speed of her catch, but the sequence of it, and the sequence was wrong. A reflex, even an augmented one, is a closed loop: stimulus, conduction, response. The stimulus arrives, the signal runs, the hand moves. The loop takes time, very little time in her case, less time than the vault's own clocks could cleanly resolve, but it takes time, and the response can only ever begin after the stimulus arrives. That was the whole theory of the graft. That was the thing they had bought and installed, a faster loop. But the telemetry showed her hand beginning to move before the round left the emitter. Not by prediction. They had ruled out prediction. The discharge was randomized. There was nothing to predict. Her hand had begun to move on the asterisk charge asterisk, on the rising wine, on some flood of information that the theory did not account for, and the instruments had recorded only by accident. The pressure of the coils, perhaps, or the field bleed, or a dozen small, tells that a veyd would need a laboratory to detect, and that this small brown creature was apparently reading with her skin, in the dark, with her eyes closed, and acting on before the thing she was reading had even happened. They had not built a faster reflex. They had built a reflex, and then discovered that the thing they had installed it into came with something the veyd had no word for and no instrument to bound. An attention, a readiness, a way of living forward into the next second that the deathworld had ground into her ancestors across 10,000 generations of not dying, and that the graft had not created but merely uncaged asterisk. Vale stood in the slow-turning light of the columns and understood, with the particular clarity of a careful man who has made a careful mistake, that the ward had spent 9 weeks and a fortune building a leash for a thing, and that at no point had anyone confirmed that the thing could be leashed. They had confirmed only that it had, so far, permitted the leash. He thought of the moment in the chamber when she had told him to move Kesser. He had read it at the time as a subject demonstrating value, showing the physicians her precision, her usefulness, currying the favor that keeps an asset off the salvage list. That was the frame he had. That was the only frame his trade had given him. But standing in the vault, reading the sequence of her hand beginning to move before the trigger, he found the frame did not hold, because a thing that was currying favor would have caught the round and let him admire it. It would not have stopped before the shot, to point out that the shot line ran through his junior physician. It would not have spent its one permitted sentence on Kesser's safety. She had not been showing him what she could do to a target. She had been telling him, where the target was so that no one would be hurt. Veyd was a physician. He had spent his life learning to read the difference between a body that intends harm and a body that intends care, because the difference matters at a bedside. And for 9,000 years, his caste had made its living at the bedsides of harder peoples. He knew what he had seen. He simply did not have anywhere in his catalogs to put it, because the catalog said that a deathworlder was a weapon, and a weapon does not warn you about your own people. He closed the telemetry. He stood a while longer in the dark. Then he did the thing that careful, frightened men do when they have glimpsed something their frame cannot hold. He decided that the frame was correct and the glimpse was noise. He decided that the subject was a superb article whose value had just multiplied, and that the buyer must be brought forward, and the demonstration scheduled, and the article sold, and off his ward before anyone had time to ask the question that had begun, quietly, to move at the bottom of his mind like a round rising in a coil. The question was, what does it want? He did not ask it. He filed the demonstration request instead and flagged it priority and named the buyer and went at last to sleep. 4 decks up, in a white cell with a drain in the floor, Ren Ashby lay awake and listened to a renewed child cry himself hoarse, and did not sleep at all. The buyer came aboard on the 3rd day after the supersonic catch, and Ren knew it before anyone told her, because the ward changed the way a house changes when it is being cleaned for a guest it is afraid of. The medtechs came through in the pre-cycle dim and scrubbed the corridor seams. They ran a fresh dressing onto the burn across her fingers, working quickly, not meeting her eyes. They brought her a meal that was better than the ward's usual paste, a dense, sweetish block with actual texture to it, and Ren understood that a thing being fattened is a thing being prepared, and she ate all of it anyway, because a body that will not eat is a body that has decided to lose, and she had not decided that. They walked her to the chamber under heavier restraint than before. 4 escorts now instead of 2. The walking cuffs had been swapped for a rigid bar that held her wrists a fixed distance apart, and there was a new device on it, a small black node that the lead escort thumbed as they moved, and that sent a fine warning ache up through the bones of her forearms. A pain collar keyed to the bar. She filed it. She filed everything now. It was the only currency the ward had left her, the knowing of things, and she gathered it the way a person lost in cold country gathers wood. The chamber had a visitor. He stood at the observation rail where Veyd usually stood, and Veyd stood a half step behind and to the side of him, in the posture of a man hosting someone he would rather not owe. The visitor was not Veyd. He was tall and lean and armored in a matte charcoal shell that fit him like a second hide, and where his face should have been there was a band of sensor slit lit from within by a steady arterial yellow, 2 points of it burning where eyes would sit. Every line of him had been built to end conversations. When he turned his head to track Ren's entrance, the movement had the smoothness of a gun turret. "This is the article," he said, not a question. The translation collar gave his voice a dry, buzzing edge. "It is smaller than the file." "They are all smaller than the file," Veyd said. "That is a great part of the value, Broker Sevik. The article does not read as a threat. It reads as a servant, a child, a nothing. And then it is the last thing in the room." Broker Sevik of the Ashen came from a people who sold violence the way the Veyd sold obedience, and between the 2 trades there had been a long and profitable friendship. The Ashen bought deathworlders when they could get them, tuned to their needs, to stand behind the chairs of nervous magnates and walk ahead of nervous convoys. A supersonic closure article was not a bodyguard. It was a category the market had not previously contained, and Sevik had flown in personally, which the whole ward understood to mean the price would be enormous and the sale already half agreed. "Demonstrate it," Sevik said. They demonstrated her. It went the way the first day had gone, except that now the point of it was not measurement but display, and the difference showed in what they were willing to risk. They fired the darts and she caught them. They fired the slug rounds and she caught them. Talith read the numbers off the extended scale in a voice that had stopped being able to sound surprised, and Sevek watched with his arterial slit fixed and unblinking, and Veyd narrated, in the smooth, pleasant register of a man moving a great deal of money, all the ways in which the article could be trusted to end a life. Reaction below the resolvable floor of our instruments, Veyd said. Closure on projectiles above the speed of sound. And this is the quality that sets the article apart from anything the ward has produced: anticipation. Observe. He gestured, and Talith did something to the emitter, and this time there was no ascending whine. They had rebuilt the discharge to fire cold and silent, no charge cycle, no tell, a round leaving the barrel with nothing to announce it. The round went for Ren's eye. She caught it, the tick, the stone-on-tile sound, and the round pinched a finger's width from her lashes. Sevek's slit brightened a shade. It cannot have heard that. It did not hear it, Veyd said, and there was in his voice, under the salesman's polish, a thing Ren recognized because she had put it there 3 days ago in this room, a hairline of fear. We do not yet know what it reads. We know only that the reading is complete. The article will catch what you cannot see coming. It will catch what asterisk it cannot see coming. That broker is what you are buying, not a fast servant, a servant that has already caught the knife before the assassin has decided to draw it. Prove that, Sevek said. The last claim, prove it. And Veyd hesitated, because the last claim was the one he did not fully understand, and a careful man does not stake a sale on a thing he does not understand. But Sevek's slit was fixed on him now, and a broker who smells hesitation smells a flaw, and a flaw brings the price down, and Veyd had a fortune riding on the number staying high. Bring the live article, Veyd said. Ren felt the room change again. The escort stiffened. Kesser at the console went very still. Talith's hand stopped. Prime, Kesser said. A live discharge in this chamber at this range. Bring it. They brought a weapon Ren had not seen before, wheeled in on a low cradle. A squat, heavy, ugly thing, a mass driver in miniature, the kind of device used to test armor plate. It did not fire ceramic needles. It fired a solid slug the size of a thumb at a velocity that would punch through a hand's depth of steel, and it fired it not for a die mark but to prove a point, and there was no version of the demonstration in which a failed catch left Ren merely marked. The article will close on a live plate driver round, Veyd told Sevek, at 4 meters from cold. If your people wish to record it now. They keyed the pain collar off. A catch cannot be made by a body seized with induced pain, and even Veyd understood that much. And Ren felt the ache drain out of her forearm bones, and she understood that for the next several seconds she would be, for the first time in 9 weeks, unrestrained and unpunished and faster than everything in the room, and that no one had noticed they had just handed her that, because they were all watching the gun. She did not take the sidearms. She did not take the chamber. She sat in the chair with her wrists in the rigid bar and looked at the ugly little driver and thought about the fact that behind her, on the shot line, past the headrest, was the sealed observation window, and behind that window in the gallery, a row of the ward's junior staff had been brought to watch the sale, because a sale like this was a thing a career could be built on witnessing. Kesser was not in the gallery. Kesser was at the console on the safe side, but the gallery was full. Prime, Ren said. The article does not speak during demonstration, Veyd said quickly to Sevek, a small apology. I'll speak anyway, Ren said, and her flat, rough, quiet voice went out into the chamber and every Veyd in it flinched, because they had all, by now, learned to flinch at it. That driver throws a solid slug. If I catch it, it stops in my hand and it takes my hand with it probably, but it stops. If I miss it, it goes through the headrest and through that window and into the people you put in the gallery to watch you sell me. So before you fire it, you need to decide something, and you need to decide it honestly, because I can't decide it for you. You need to decide whether you actually believe I'll catch it. Because if any part of you doesn't believe it, if you're bluffing the broker with my hand, then what you're really doing is firing a plate driver into a room full of your own students to make a sale. That's the choice. I'm just telling you what's on the shot line. Someone should. The chamber was silent. Sevic's slit swung slowly from Ren to Veil and held there. It was, Ren understood, exactly the wrong thing to have said if the goal were to be a good article. A good article would have caught the round and let the gallery gasp. She had instead, in front of the buyer in the middle of the closing, made the seller say out loud whether he believed his own product could be trusted not to kill the audience. And in doing so she had put the flaw Sevic was hunting for right into the open air. Not a flaw in her, a flaw in Veil, the hairline of fear made audible. "Move the article's chair off the gallery axis," Sevic said, dry, and there was something new in the buzzing voice, not quite amusement but the cousin of it. "And clear the gallery, Prime. Your student was correct. One does not fire a plate driver into an audience to close a deal. If the article cannot be demonstrated safely, the article's value is theoretical, and I do not pay for theory." Veil cleared the gallery. They repositioned the chair so the shot line ran into a block of test armor instead of a window full of witnesses. And only then, with no one down range, did they fire the plate driver, and Ren caught the slug. And the catch broke 2 bones in her hand and dislocated her thumb and drove her whole arm back into the armrest hard enough to crack the polymer, and she made no sound at all. She sat with the ruined hand cradled in her lap and the slug still in her grip, a small ferocious dent of metal, and she looked at Sevic with a face wiped entirely clean of pain, and she said, "There. Now it's proven. Was it worth the students not being in the room? I think it was. I think you'll get more use out of a servant who tells you where the shot line runs than out of one who just catches things. But that's your trade, not mine." Broker Sevic of the Ashen looked at her for a long moment. "I will take the article," he said to Veil, "at the number we discussed, on one amended condition." The slit brightened. "I want it as it is. Do not tune out the mouth. My principals are surrounded day and night by servants who tell them only what closes the deal. I have watched 3 of them die because no one downrange would say where the shot line ran." He turned for the door. "Prepare the article for transfer. I will send my medical people to confirm the merchandise and my payment when they do. Do not damage the hand further. I have a use for the hand." He left. The chamber let out its held breath. Talith slumped over the console. 2 of the escorts holstered weapons they had not realized they'd drawn. And Veil stood at the rail and looked at the small brown-haired creature cradling a shattered hand in the wreckage of an armrest. And he thought, he could not stop himself thinking, that she had just, in the space of 90 seconds, taken control of a demonstration in which she was the restrained and augmented and pain-collared merchandise, and steered it to the exact outcome that protected a gallery full of strangers, and closed her own sale on better terms than he had been able to negotiate. And done all of it in a voice that never once rose above the flat register of a person reading a gauge. She had not fought the leash, she had used it. She had let them believe the whole time that they were selling a weapon, and she had spent the entire demonstration quietly keeping people from being killed, including the students of the man who was selling her, and she had made it look like value. "What does it want?" the question said, rising in the coil at the bottom of his mind. He still did not ask it, but it was louder now. They took Ren back to the tier and set the hand. A medtech did it fast and rough. No anesthetic, because anesthetic was not on the schedule for merchandise, and splinted it and left her in the amber dim. And down the corridor the man began his evening prayer, 9 phrases, and across the corridor the woman spent her hour of grief. And 4 doors up, when the woman finished, Ilo began to cry. Ren lay on the shelf with her ruined hand across her chest and listened, and did the arithmetic she had been doing for 3 days. In 16 days she would be aboard an Ashen transport, tuned and collared and sold, standing behind the chair of a nervous magnate, catching knives for a person she would never be permitted to refuse. That was the future the ward had built and the broker had bought. She could see it with the same forward clarity that let her see a round before it fired. She did not rage against it. Rage did nothing, and she had a strict economy in things that did nothing. But there was one variable the arithmetic kept returning to, and it was not herself. If she left on that transport, Ilo left with nothing. The renewed child had no buyer. He was an error on a manifest, a biological of no instrument value, and Wren had heard enough of how the ward disposed of things of no value to know what happened to an error that could not be sold and could not be returned. When the humans were gone, sold, or salvaged, the tier emptied and cleaned for the next lot, the error 4 doors up would be reconciled. That was the ward's word for it. She had heard a med tech use it. Reconciled. So the arithmetic had 2 futures in it. In one, Wren went to the ocean and was fast and useful and alive, and a 6-year-old was reconciled in a white room with a drain in the floor. In the other, Wren had not finished the other. The other was still only a shape, an outline she was filling in the way she filled in a shot line, from the tells, from the pressures, from the way the frightened thing moved. But it had begun to have edges. The seal on her door chummed softly. It was the middle of the rest cycle. No one came to a cell in the middle of the rest cycle. Kesser stepped inside alone and let the door close. The junior physician stood just inside the seal with all 4 hands held low and open, the veyd gesture for I carry nothing, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Wren did not sit up. She lay on the shelf with her splinted hand on her chest and watched Kesser, with the patience of a person who has learned that the one who speaks first in the dark has usually come to give something away. "You told the Prime to move me," Kesser said finally. "On the first day, before the supersonic round, you did not have to. The shot line was real. I checked the geometry afterward. The round would have taken me through the throat if your closure had failed by a hand's width." A pause. The hollow between Kesser's upper arms filled and emptied with a quick, nervous breath. Subjects in this tier do not warn us of things. I have worked the augmentation ward for 4 years. In 4 years, no article has ever spent a permitted word to keep a physician alive. I have not been able to stop thinking about it. "You said the thing about the injury," Wren said. "In the meeting, you said moving the emitter to my throat put the shot line into the console. Nobody listened to you, so I said it louder. That's all it was. You'd already done the seeing. I just have a louder voice in that room than you do, which is strange because I'm the merchandise." She shifted the hand on her chest. "Why are you here, Kesser? It's the middle of your rest cycle and you came to a cell you didn't have to come to. That's expensive for you. So you want something or you're here to give me something. Which is it?" Kesser was quiet for a moment. Then the junior physician crossed the small cell and crouched by the shelf, 4 hands folded, and spoke very low, under the range where the cell's monitors resolved words into meaning. "There is a child in this tier," Kesser said, 4 doors from yours, a renew. He was taken by an error and he cannot be sold and he cannot be sent home, and when your lot clears he will be reconciled. And I have watched it happen twice before to others, and I have told myself both times that it was not my department." The glassy eyes came up to Wren's. "I did not come to give you anything. I came because I think you already know all of this, and I think you are doing arithmetic, and I came to tell you that whatever the arithmetic is, I am not on the Prime side of it. That is all I have to give. It is not much, but you should know the shot line runs both ways and someone should tell you." Wren looked at the junior physician for a long moment in the amber dark. "All right," she said. "Then sit down and tell me how the reconciliation is done. Not because I want to hear it, because if I'm going to change it, I need to know exactly how it works, the same way I needed to know where the shot line ran. Start with the room." Kesser told her. The reconciliation room was on the lowest deck of the ward, past the analysis vault, a chamber the staff called disposal in their manifests and never allowed. Kesser had never been inside it. The medtechs who worked it were a separate section, quiet, who did not eat with the rest and were not asked what they did. What Kesser knew was structural. gathered over 4 years the way Wren gathered wood. The room vented to the outer hall. The room was on a dedicated environmental loop so that whatever happened in it did not touch the ward's air. The room had a single approach corridor with 2 pressure doors in series, because a chamber that vents to vacuum must be sealed from the station it hangs off of, and a chamber sealed by 2 doors in series can only be opened 1 door at a time. Wren listened to all of it lying flat on the shelf with her eyes closed, and when Kesser finished she was quiet for a while, arranging it. 2 doors in series, she said. 1 opens at a time, so there's a control point. Somewhere a console decides which door is allowed to be open, and it will never allow both, because if it allowed both the ward would lose its air. What runs that console? Environmental section. It is automatic. There is an override, but it is. Everything's automatic until it isn't. Where's the override? On the reconciliation console itself, inside the corridor between the 2 doors. It is a safety measure. The operator must be present inside the airlock length to force a cycle, so that no one forces it from outside by accident. Kesser's hands tightened. Why does the override matter to you? You cannot reach it. You will be aboard the ocean transport. Maybe, Wren said. The transport isn't for 16 days. A lot of shot lines can change in 16 days. Go back to your rest cycle, Kesser. You've been in here too long already. If a monitor flags it, you'll be no use to anyone, including yourself. But answer one more thing before you go. She opened her eyes. The Oceans sent their own medical people to confirm the merchandise. When do they come and where do they do it? 6 days in the primary chamber. They will run their own closure tests, confirm the article's condition, and authorize payment. Kesser rose. You should not hope for anything from the confirmation if that is what the arithmetic is doing. The Ocean do not miss things. Their medical section is not soft like ours. They are the ones who make the servants that stand behind the chairs, and they have made a great many, and none of the servants ever leave except in the way you are thinking, which does not happen, because the Ocean do not miss things. I'm not hoping, Wren said. Hope does nothing. I'm counting. There's a difference. Go on. And Kesser, thank you, not for the information, for the middle of the cycle. That was expensive and you spent it on me, and I noticed. I notice everything now. It's the one thing they gave me that I'll keep. Kesser left. The seal chummed. The prayer had ended hours ago, and the weeping had ended, and even Ilo had cried himself into the exhausted silence that passed in the tear for sleep. Wren lay in the amber dark and turned the room over and over. 2 doors, 1 console, an override that must be reached from inside, and somewhere in the turning she found the shape she had been filling in, and its edges came clear, and it was not an escape. She had stopped days ago, believing in escape. Escape was a shot line that ran through Ilo. A body that runs saves one. She had been raised on a sundering world by people who did not run, not because they were brave, but because on a sundering world, the ones who ran got everyone behind them killed, and the ones who stood in the door and read the shot line and told the others where to move, those were the ones the world had kept. Her grandmother had stood in a door once in a flood and put 9 people through a window before the water took the house, and had not at any point run. Wren had been 4. She remembered the water, and she remembered her grandmother's flat voice saying, "You next." Then you, reading the flood the way Wren now read a coil, and she remembered that the flat voice had never once risen, even at the end, even alone in the door. That was the thing the veyd had not measured and could not, because they had no instrument for it. They had measured how fast her hand could close. They had not measured what the hand was for. The Ocean confirmation team came on the 6th day, and they did not miss things. There were 4 of them, armored in the same matte charcoal as Sevik but slimmer, marked with a medical sigil, and they moved through the primary chamber with an economy that made the veyd look, by contrast, like the soft scholars they were. They did not narrate. They did not admire. They set up their own instruments beside the wards, and they ran the article through a battery of closures with a cold thoroughness that Wren found, privately, restful. Here, at last, were people who understood that the point of a test was information and not theater. They fired at her from behind, from the side, from two emitters at once. She caught both rounds, one in each hand, the shattered one screaming under the splint, and set them down parallel. They fired a round timed to the exact instant one of the escorts dropped a tray, to see if noise could mask the coil, and she caught it. They fired nothing at all, 3 times in a row, empty discharge cycles, to see whether she was reading the coil or merely twitching at the whine, and each empty time she did not move, sat still, waiting, which told them she was not guessing, and the lead confirmer made a small notation and the arterial slit of its visor brightened. Anticipation confirmed, it buzzed to the room. The article closes on the field, not the sound. It cannot be masked. Recommend acquisition. The broker did not overstate. And then, because the Ocean did not miss things, the lead confirmer did the one test the veyd had never thought to run, because the veyd measured weapons and the Ocean employed them. Load a live plate round, it said, and place a ward technician on the shot line. The chamber went cold. That is not necessary, Vale said. The live closure was demonstrated to Broker Sevic. It is recorded. It was demonstrated into an armor block, the confirmer said. I am not confirming that the article can catch a round. The broker's file already told me that. I am confirming what my principals are paying for, which is not a catch. It is a choice. A servant that catches for a block is a reflex. A servant that catches for a * person *. When the person is one it has no reason to value, that is an asset that can be trusted to catch for a principal it has no reason to love. Load the round. Place a technician downrange. If the article closes, we authorize. If it does not, we have learned the article is a reflex and not a servant, and the price falls accordingly. Either way, I have my information. Kessler moved before the words had finished. Not toward safety, toward the shot line. The junior physician stepped up onto the marked place on the floor, downrange of the little plate driver, 4 hands at its sides, and said, in a voice that shook only slightly, I will stand it. No, Wren said. Everyone looked at her. Kessler, get off the line, Wren said in the flat gauge-reading voice, and the junior physician, who had spent a middle of cycle in her cell and knew that voice now, hesitated. You stood in front of the round because you decided it was your turn to be brave, and I understand that, but you're doing arithmetic with the wrong number in it. Look at the geometry. You're 1.5 meters tall. The driver's on a low cradle. If they fire and I close, the round stops in my hand. If I miss by a finger's width and my catching hand is broken, they said it themselves. They know it's broken, the round doesn't stop, it deflects. And a deflected plate round off a broken closure goes low, not high. It goes into your legs, not your throat. You'd live and never walk. That's a worse outcome than if they'd put a taller tech there, because a taller tech takes the deflection center mass and dies clean, and I have less to think about. You've made yourself the most expensive person to stand there. Get off the line. Put the tallest escort in the room on it. I'll close for the escort exactly as hard as I'd close for you. That's the whole point of what they're testing, and it happens to be true, so let it be true with the geometry that hurts the fewest people. The confirmer's slit had not moved from her the entire time she spoke. Prime, it said quietly. It just chose the shot line for a technician it has known for 6 days. It weighed the injury geometries allowed. It optimized the placement to reduce total harm, including harm it would have to catch through a broken hand. The visor turned to Vale. You told the broker you were selling a weapon that had already caught the knife before the assassin drew it. You were mistaken about the merchandise. This is not a weapon that has caught the knife. It is a * medic that has caught the knife. Do you understand the difference? A weapon we can use. A medic decides who to catch for. A medic that decides is not a servant. It is a partner you have not asked to consent. Vale said nothing. Place the tallest escort on the line, the confirmer said, as the article instructed, and load the round. I will have my confirmation, and then we will have a longer conversation about what precisely is being sold. They placed an escort on the line. They fired the plate round. Wren caught it, and the broken hand failed the way she had known it might, the bones grinding, the thumb tearing free of its socket a second time, and the round did not stop clean, but it stopped. She took the deflection into her own forearm rather than let it go low, spun her whole body into the failing catch, and let the slug bury itself in the meat of her arm below the elbow rather than let it skip off toward anyone's legs. And she sat back in the chair with a plate slug lodged in her forearm and blood coming through the sleeve at a steady, unhurried rate, and her face wiped clean of everything. Confirmed, the lead confirmer said. It did not sound satisfied. It sounded, if anything, troubled. The article catches for a stranger through 2 failed hand bones and takes the deflection into its own body to spare a bystander's legs. That is not a servant's behavior. Servants preserve themselves. That is why they need replacing. This preserves everyone but itself. The visor swung to Veil one last time. I will report to the broker that the merchandise is genuine and that the merchandise is a problem. You have grown something you do not have a category for, Prime. So have we, for that matter, across 400 years of buying your articles, and we have learned to be afraid of exactly this. Get the slug out of its arm. We resume the acquisition discussion at the next cycle. The Ashen filed out. The ward moved. Medtechs converged on Wren, on the slug, on the blood, and she let them. And over their pale, scrambling shoulders she found Veil at the rail, not moving, watching her with the fixed stillness of a man at a bedside who has just heard a diagnosis he already suspected and hoped to be wrong about. You keep protecting them, Veil said. It was not an accusation and not quite a question. It was a man reading his own instrument at last. The gallery, the junior physician, the escort, people who have done nothing for you and one of whom was placed downrange of you deliberately. You are the fastest thing this ward has ever produced, and you have spent every closure, every single one, reducing the number of people harmed in a room designed to harm. Why? Tell me why. I have measured everything about you, and I cannot find the number that predicts this, and it is the only thing I want to know. The medtechs had the slug half out of her arm. Wren did not look at it. You built me to catch things, she said. You didn't ask what I want to catch. That's the whole mistake, and it's not a small one, and it's not yours alone. Your whole trade is built on it. You take a thing from a world that spent 10,000 generations learning to stand in doorways, and you make it faster, and you assume faster means it'll do what you pointed at. But you never made me anything. You uncaged something that was already there, and the thing that was already there isn't a weapon. It's a person who was raised to read the flood and put the others through the window first. She turned her head and looked at him, flat, level, unhurried. You asked what it wants. I heard you not ask it 3 times in that vault where you think no one hears you. I'll answer it since you can't. It wants the child 4 doors from mine to not be reconciled. That's all. That's the whole want. Everything else I've done. I've done to keep the arithmetic open long enough to get to that. Now take the slug out of my arm, Prime, or step aside and let Kessler do it. Because the 2 of you are the only people on this ward who have started doing the seeing, and I'm going to need at least one of you able to see when the time comes. Broker Sevik returned to the primary chamber at the next cycle, and he did not come to close the sale. He came to renegotiate it, and Wren, standing between 2 escorts with her arm freshly closed and her hand freshly reset, understood from the set of his charcoal shoulders that the confirmer's report had done exactly what she had intended it to do, and exactly what she had feared it might. My medical section has confirmed the merchandise, Sevik said, and has recommended against acquisition in its present state. You have grown a defect into your finest article, Prime. The article chooses. My principals do not pay for servants that choose. They pay for servants that do not. A servant that decides who is worth catching for is a servant that will, one day, decide the principal is not worth catching for, And on that day the principal is dead, and I have sold a knife that turned in the hand. I have watched it happen. I will not broker it." "The behavior can be corrected," Veyd said. Wren did not move. She had known this sentence was coming. She had read it in the confirmer's troubled voice, in the way the Ashen did not miss things, but knowing a round is coming and hearing it fire are different. And she let the sentence arrive with a little room around it, the way she let everything arrive now, and she filed it, and she waited for the rest. "Explain," said Sevek. "The article's protectiveness," Veyd said, and Wren heard the hairline in his voice. The place where the word he was using did not fit the thing he had seen, and he knew it did not fit and used it anyway, because his trade had no better word. "It is not intrinsic to the graft. The graft is pure conduction. It is speed and closure, nothing more. The choosing sits above it in the subject's own volition in what you call the medic. We are the finest leash crafters in the surveyed volume broker. We can go in above the graft and sever the choosing from the closing. We can leave you the speed and take the volition. You would have your reflex, a hand that catches whatever it is pointed at, for whoever holds the pointer and never once asks why. A compliance revision. It is a standard procedure on unruly articles. It would require perhaps 12 days to plan and 1 to perform, and it would reduce the article's inconvenient qualities to 0, while preserving every quality you are buying." The chamber was silent. Wren stood between the escorts and read the shot line of the next 12 days, and found that it ran directly through the center of her. "And the risk to the merchandise," Sevek said. "Non-trivial," Veyd admitted. "The revision severs a great deal. In roughly a third of subjects the volition does not sever cleanly, and what remains is reduced. But the speed survives in nearly all cases, and the speed is the asset. You would have a 2 in 3 chance of a compliant supersonic servant, and a 1 in 3 chance of a compliant supersonic servant that is also simple. Either outcome closes for whoever holds the pointer. Neither outcome chooses. I can perform it before transfer, at no additional charge, as a condition of sale." "Do it," said Sevek, "and discount the price by the risk. I will pay 2 in 3 of the number for a 2 in 3 chance." The arterial slit swung briefly to Wren and held. "You understand what is being discussed, article. I saw you file it. You have that habit. I watched you file the plate driver and the shot lines in the confirmer's report, one after another, into whatever ledger you keep behind that flat little face. So file this. In 12 days, they will take the part of you that stood in front of the round for the technician, and they will cut it out and throw it in the disposal loop. And what walks onto my transport will be your hands and your speed, and none of the thing that made my confirmer afraid. I am doing you the courtesy of telling you, because you did me the courtesy once of telling me where the shot line ran. Consider us even." He left to arrange the payment schedule. Wren stood between the escorts and did not react, because reacting did nothing, and she had a strict economy, and she needed every measure of herself for the arithmetic, which had just changed all of its numbers at once. 12 days, not 16, and at the end of the 12, not a transport, a table, and a procedure that would leave her hands and take her doorway, cut out the thing her grandmother had put in her in a flood 15 years ago, and throw it in the loop that vented to vacuum. She found she was not afraid of dying. She had made her peace with dying on the first day in the transit hold the way you make peace with weather. But this was not dying. This was being kept and emptied and made into a hand that caught for anyone, and there was a specific horror in it that got under even her flat economy, because a hand that caught for anyone would one day be pointed at a doorway, and it would catch, and it would not know to stand in the door instead. It would catch the round meant for the magnate and let the child behind the magnate take the next one. It would be fast, and it would be useless in the only way that had ever mattered. She filed it. She let it have its room, and then she set it beside the other articles on the ledger, parallel tidy, and she began, with 11 days now, and a broken hand and a slug wound in her arm, and one junior physician and possibly one prime who had started doing the seeing, to count. The weeping woman was salvaged on the 9th day before the procedure, and the ward did not tell Ren, but the ward did not have to, because Ren read it in the silence. The woman across the corridor had wept for exactly 1 hour after every dimming for 63 days. Ren had set her clock by it the way she set it by the prayer. And on the 9th day, the lights dimmed and the hour came and there was no weeping, and Ren lay on the shelf and understood that the woman's graft had not settled, that she had been one of the ones the conduction did not take cleanly, and that a subject the graft did not take was salvage, and that salvage was reconciled, and that somewhere below the analysis vault, in a room that vented to the outer hall, the woman who had budgeted her grief so carefully had run out of days to spend it in. The tear was quieter after that. The prayer still came, morning and night, 9 phrases. But the hour of grief was gone from the schedule of the corridor, and its absence was louder than the grief had ever been, and Ilo, 4 doors up, seemed to feel it too, because that night the child did not cry. He was silent, the specific brittle silence of a small thing that has understood, without being told, that the crying ones go away. Ren lay in the dark and listened to the silence where the weeping used to be, and she did the thing she almost never did, which was to let herself feel the weight of the ledger for a moment before she set it down. 63 days, 1 hour a day, and then a room with a drain. That was what the ward called an asset that did not perform. That was the future 4 doors up, wearing feathers, 6 years old, gone quiet. She did not rage, but she made a decision in the dark, and the decision had the flat finality of a gauge reaching its stop, and once she had made it she did not revisit it, because revisiting a decision was a thing that did nothing. She was going to open the arithmetic all the way. And to open it all the way she was going to need the procedure to happen, not to submit to it, but because the procedure was the one event in the next 11 days that would take her out of the compliance tier, past the analysis vault, down to the lowest deck, into the length of corridor where the reconciliation room's override sat between 2 pressure doors, with her hands unbound, because a compliance revision could not be performed on a subject whose hands were bound. Any more than a live catch could be tested through a pain collar. They would have to free her hands to take her hands. It was the one flaw in their arithmetic, and it was a large one, and they had not seen it because they had never once, in 9,000 years of leashcraft, needed to imagine that an article would want the table. Kesser came again in the middle of the rest cycle, 2 days before the procedure, and this time the junior physician did not stand with open hands by the door. Kesser crossed straight to the shelf and crouched and spoke low and fast, and there was something new in the 4 folded hands, a tremor that was not fear of being caught but something closer to grief. "They have moved the procedure forward," Kesser said, "to tomorrow. Sevik's transport has a departure window and the Prime does not want to hold the article any longer than he must. He says the merchandise is his word restless. He does not know what you are, but he has begun to be afraid of what you are, the way I was afraid on the first day, and a frightened Prime shortens his own timelines. Tomorrow, Ren, in the surgical theater below the vault, they will free your hands to position you and they will put you under and they will." Kesser stopped. "I cannot say it. I have read the procedure. I will not describe it to you the way you asked me to describe the reconciliation room, because I find I cannot." "You don't have to," Ren said. "I already know what it takes, Sevik told me." He was being courteous. She sat up on the shelf, slow, favoring the arm. "Tomorrow's better than 11 days from now. Tell me the geometry of the surgical theater. Where's the vault relative to it? Where's the reconciliation corridor? How many doors between the theater and the lowest deck, and which of them are pressure doors and which are just seals? And Kesser, before you tell me any of it, I need you to understand what you're doing by telling me, because it's the same thing you did on the first cycle, except much more expensive, and I won't take it from you without you knowing the price." "I know the price," Kesser said. "Say it then, out loud, so it's real and you chose it." Kesser was quiet for a moment. The glassy eyes came up. "If I help you," the junior physician said, and it is discovered, I will be salvaged, not dismissed, salvaged. A physician who turns an article loose is not an error to be corrected. It is a thing that has taken the ward's side against the ward, and the ward reconciles what takes its side against it. I have watched them do it to their own. I know the room. I have stood outside the second pressure door with the section that does not eat with the rest on an inspection 4 years ago, and I heard what a reconciliation sounds like through a pressure door, and I have not slept a full rest cycle since. A breath, filling and emptying the hollow of the upper arms. That is the price. I am saying it out loud. I am choosing it. Now stop asking me whether I am sure, because every time you ask I have to choose it again, and I have already chosen it as many times as I can afford. Tell me what you need and let me give it to you before I run out of times. Wren looked at the junior physician for a long moment in the amber dark, and something moved behind her flat, still face that she did not let reach the surface, because letting it reach the surface would have cost her something she could not spare tonight. "All right," she said, "then here's what I need, and none of it is what you think. I don't need you to open a door for me or turn off a monitor or stand in a corridor. If it goes the way I'm reading it, you never touch anything, and when they ask you afterward, you can tell them the truth, which is that you did nothing because you will have done nothing. What I need from you is smaller than that and harder than that. I need you to make sure the child is in the reconciliation corridor tomorrow, not the room, the corridor, between the 2 pressure doors at the console at the exact time they take me to the theater." She held up her good hand before Kessler could speak. "I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I'm asking you to deliver a 6-year-old to the disposal deck. I'm not. I'm asking you to trust that I've read the shot line, and that the safest place on this station for that child tomorrow is the one place everyone will assume is the most dangerous, because it's the one place I'll be able to reach. Can you do that? Can you get Ilo into that corridor and then walk away and do nothing and let them ask you afterward and tell them the truth?" Kessler stared at her. "That is insane," the junior physician said. "It's arithmetic," Wren said. "It only looks insane because you're standing at the wrong end of the shot line. Come stand at my end for a second and it'll look like the only door left. Can you do it or not?" Kessler was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, the 4 hands folded and unfolded and folded the other way. The gesture Wren had seen Vale make at the rail. The gesture the veyd used when they had decided that nothing unusual was occurring, deployed now by a junior physician deciding, in the amber dark, to do the most unusual thing of a soft and careful life. "I can do it," Kessler said. "God help me, I can do it. Now tell me the rest, because there has to be a rest, and I would rather know all of it than lie awake filling in the parts you did not say." "There's a rest," Wren agreed, "but it's mine to carry, not yours. The less you know about my end, the truer your answers stay when they question you, and I need your answers true, because if they salvage you for this, then I've traded a child for a physician and the arithmetic doesn't balance and I won't do it. So you get the child into the corridor and you walk away, and everything after that is my hands. That's the deal. That's the only deal I'll make." She lay back down on the shelf, slow, the arm stiff. "Go sleep, Kessler. Or lie in the dark and don't sleep, which is what I'll be doing. Either way, go. Tomorrow's a long day, and it starts with them freeing my hands, and I want to be rested enough to be fast, because I only get to be fast once. And everything I've counted for 11 days comes down to whether I'm fast enough in the one length of corridor that matters." They came for her at the start of the work cycle, 6 escorts and a midsection she had not seen before, and they freed her hands. They did it at the door of her cell, with practiced care, releasing the rigid bar and the pain node and the walking cuffs, and leaving her wrists open and bare for the first time in 70 days. Because a subject bound for the surgical theater must be positioned on the table with open hands, and open hands cannot be positioned through a rigid bar. Wren stood in the doorway of her cell, rubbing the raw places on her wrists with the ordinary slowness of a person easing a stiffness, and no one in the corridor understood that they had just handed her the only thing she had asked the universe for in 70 days, which was to be unbound and awake, and in a corridor at the same time. She did not use it yet. That was the discipline the whole plan rested on, that she would carry the freedom, unused, past every place it was tempting to spend it, all the way down to the one length of corridor where spending it would balance the arithmetic. A hand that closes 2 early closes on nothing. Her grandmother had put 9 people through a window in the order the water demanded, not the order her fear wanted, and Wren walked between the escorts down and out of the compliance tier with her hands open and idle at her sides and spent nothing. They took her down, past the analysis vault, where the columns of veyd script turned slowly in the air and Prime Asan Vale stood among them, not looking at her as she passed, which told her that he had started doing the seeing and did not yet know what to do with what he saw, down the long approach to the surgical theater. And there, a thing she had not planned for, a variable arriving late, Broker Sevik was waiting outside the theater doors, with 4 of his charcoal medical people and 2 others who were not medical at all. The 2 others were built like the escorts had been built, but heavier, and where the escorts carried sidearms, these carried something long and cradled across the body, matte and functional, and Wren read the shape of it and filed it and felt the arithmetic shift again. "I will observe the procedure," Sevik said to Vale. "My principals have invested a great deal in this article, and I will confirm with my own sensors that the revision severs what you claim it severs, and I have brought security." The arterial slit did not move from Wren. "You told me the article is restless. A restless article on the morning you take its volition is an article with nothing left to lose, and I have learned to respect what a deathworlder does with nothing left to lose. My people will hold the theater until the article is under. Do not take it personally, Prime. It is only that your ward is soft, and I would rather not lose a fortune to your softness in the last hour." Vale inclined his long pale head, and Wren watched him do it, and watched the hairline of fear in him, and understood that the Prime had brought her here to do a thing he had begun to suspect was wrong and lacked, still, the frame to refuse it, and that the frame was the whole problem, and that no argument of hers was going to install a new frame in a 9,000-year-old trade in the last hour before a table. So she did not argue. She filed the 2 heavy Ashen and their long weapons, and she filed the surgical theater doors, and she read, ahead, down the corridor past the theater, the shorter, darker approach that Kessler had described, the one that ran to the lowest deck and the 2 pressure doors and the override between them. And she read something else, the way she now read a coil before it fired, a pressure, a field, a wrongness bleeding up through the deck plates from below and behind, from the direction of the docking gantry where the Ashen transport had mated to the station's flank. She had been reading it faintly for a full cycle, and had not known what it was, and now, with the heavy weapons in the corridor and the transport straining at the gantry and the whole cramped geometry of the lower ward laid out in front of her augmented attention, she understood what she was reading, and the arithmetic finished itself all at once, the way a shot line resolves when the last variable drops in. The Ashen transport was too large for the ward's gantry. She had felt it in the deck for a cycle, the low groan of a docking clamp holding a mass it had not been rated for, the flex in the plates, the field bleed of overtaxed couplings. Sevik had flown in personally on a warship's tender to buy a category the market had never contained, and he had mated that tender to a scholar's research station built to receive supply barges, and the clamp had been holding it, groaning, for a cycle, and it was going to let go. Not because anyone attacked it, not because of any plan of hers. Because it was a soft ward and a hard ship, and the geometry had been wrong from the moment they docked, and the failing thing had been announcing itself the whole time to the one creature on the station fast enough to hear it, and no one had listened, because the one creature was the merchandise. When the clamp let go, the transport would tear free of the gantry, and the gantry would tear out of the flank of the ward, and the flank of the ward would open to vacuum, and the whole lower deck, the theater, the vault, the reconciliation corridor, the approach, all of it would try to empty itself into space through the wound in a matter of seconds. And the only thing standing between that and the people in these corridors would be the pressure doors. The reconciliation room's 2 pressure doors, in series, the ones built to seal a chamber that vents to the hull. The single most survivable structure on the lowest deck was the airlock length Wren had spent 11 days learning the shape of, and she had asked Kesser to put the child there this morning not because it was clever, but because she had read, without yet knowing she had read it, that it was the one place on the failing ward that would still have air when the flank came open. She had 11 days ago mistaken her own reading for a plan. It had been a plan. It had also been the truth arriving early, the way the truth arrived for her now, through the skin before the light. "Prime," Wren said, in the flat gauge-reading voice, and every veyd in the corridor flinched, and Sevik's slit brightened, and the 2 heavy Ashen shifted their long weapons a degree toward her. "Get everyone off this deck. Now, the docking clamp on the Ashen gantry is failing. It's been failing for a cycle. Your transport outmasses the clamp rating and the plates under us are flexing at the coupling and the field bleed is climbing, and when it goes it takes the flank of your ward with it. I can't give you a number, I'm not an instrument, but it's less time than it takes to argue with me, so don't. Get your people up the approach and behind a pressure seal. Sevik, get your medical section off this deck. They can confirm your merchandise from anywhere. That's the shot line. I'm telling you because someone should, and I'm the only one who can hear it." For one full breath, no one moved. Then Broker Sevik of the Ashen, who came from a people who sold violence, and had survived 400 years of selling it by knowing exactly when a thing that had nothing to gain was telling the truth, said one word to his security in the buzzing edge of the collar, and his 2 heavy soldiers turned and moved up the approach at a dead run, and his 4 medical people went after them. And Sevik himself did not run, because a broker does not run in front of merchandise, but he walked very quickly. And he said over his shoulder, "Clear your ward, Prime. The article does not lie about shot lines. I have learned that much." Veyd did not move. Veyd stood in the mouth of the surgical theater with his 4 hands folded, and his soft scholar's body rooted to the flexing deck, and he looked at Wren, unbound, free, faster than everything, standing in a corridor she could have crossed and left behind before the light of her leaving reached his eyes, and Wren looked back at him, and saw that the Prime had at last, in the final hour, gotten the frame. That he understood now, standing on the failing deck, that the thing he had spent 9 weeks measuring had just spent its one hoarded chance at freedom to warn the man who was about to cut out its soul that a clamp was failing, that the article had not run, that it had instead done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had come out the same as it always came out with her, which was fewer people harmed. "Go, Prime," Wren said, gentler than she had said anything to him. "I read it early. There's still time for you if you go now. Up the approach behind the vault seal with your people. Go, you've started doing the seeing and I'd rather you live to finish." "The child," Veyd said, his voice had gone strange. "The renew, Kesser moved it to the reconciliation corridor at the start of the cycle. I saw the log and I did not understand why and I did not stop it because I have stopped understanding a great many of my own ward's motions." The glassy eyes fixed on her. "You planned that, 11 days ago. You had the junior physician put the child in the one chamber on this deck that will hold air. You read the clamp 11 days before it failed." "I read that the corridor was survivable," Wren said. "I didn't know why until just now. Sometimes the seeing runs ahead of the reasons. Go, Prime, I'm going to the corridor. That's where the child is and that's where the air is and that's where I'm useful. You go the other way up to your people. We don't have time to say anything else, and there's nothing else worth saying." And she turned, and she went down the dark approach toward the lowest deck at a speed that made the corridor lights smear. And behind her she heard the first shriek of the clamp beginning, at last, to fail. A long rising tone, exactly like the ascending whine of an emitter drinking power, the sound of a thing about to release more force than the room was built to hold. And Ren Ashby ran toward it, the way her grandmother had walked toward the flood. Because on a sundering world, the ones the world keeps are the ones who run at the failing thing, and put the others through the window first. The lowest deck opened in front of her as she came off the approach, and she read the whole of it in a single, unhurried, arriving instant, the way she read a chamber before a shot. The reconciliation corridor ran off to her left, the outer pressure door standing open, the length of airlock beyond it, the console with its override set into the wall at the midpoint, and the inner pressure door at the far end sealed shut. At the console stood Ilo, small, feathered, hollow-boned, exactly where Kessler had left him at the start of the cycle, a 6-year-old error on a manifest, standing very still in the one place on the deck that would hold air, and not understanding at all why he was there. And between Ilo and the open outer door, in the main length of the lowest deck, were 4 veyd of the section that did not eat with the rest. The reconciliation medtechs, going about the quiet work of their quiet room, unaware that the flank of the ward behind them had begun to tear. Ren had time, a slice of time so thin that no instrument on the ward could have resolved it, and so wide to her that she walked through it to file all of it. The open outer door, the 4 techs in the path of the coming wound, the child at the console, the inner door sealed. And behind her, up the approach, the prime, who had not gone up to his people after all, who had followed her down because he had gotten the frame too late to act on it wisely, and now stood at the mouth of the lowest deck with his 4 soft hands folded, in the path of everything. Then the clamp let go, and the flank of the ward came open, and the lowest deck tried to empty itself into the dark. There is a particular violence to a hull breach that the veyd, soft-bodied and slow, had spent 9,000 years engineering their lives to never once feel. The air does not leak. It leaves, all at once, in a single enormous exhalation, and it takes with it everything the air can lift, instruments, panels, tools, and bodies, and it accelerates all of it toward the wound faster than sound, and a body moving faster than sound toward a torn edge of hull is a body that will be cut in half by the edge before it ever reaches the dark beyond it. The 4 reconciliation techs came off their feet in the first instant, snatched backward toward the wound, and the loose instruments of their quiet room came off the benches and went with them, and the whole screaming contents of the lowest deck became, in the space of one exhalation, a storm of supersonic debris and falling people moving toward a blade of torn steel. Ren caught the first tech a meter from the edge. She did not so much catch him as arrive at him, crossed the deck against the wind of the emptying air, faster than the air, faster than the debris, and closed one hand around the tech's trailing arm and set her feet against a deck cleat and stopped him, and the stopping tore something in her shoulder that she filed and did not feel. She turned with the tech and threw him, not gently. There was no time for gentle, and gentle was for people who had time, threw him back up the deck toward the reconciliation corridor's open door, into the dead spot behind the outflow where the wind could not reach him, and he tumbled through the outer pressure door and fetched up against the console beside the child, alive, and Ren was already gone from the place she had thrown him. Second tech. This one was farther, already past her, already at the edge, already being folded over the torn lip of the hull by the wind. Ren went after her into the outflow itself, into the part of the deck where the air was moving fastest, where a body should not be able to move against the wind at all, and she reached the tech at the very edge, at the blade, with the dark and the stars a hand's width past the torn steel, and she got a fist into the tech's collar and hauled backward with everything the deathworld had ground into 10,000 generations of her blood, and for one instant they hung there together at the lip. The tech's body streaming out into vacuum and Ren's broken hand and torn shoulder the only things between the tech and the dark. She did not let go. That was the whole of it, in the end. Everything the veyd had measured, and everything they had failed to measure came down to a torn hand at a torn edge that did not let go. She walked the second tech back up the deck against the wind, one step at a time, against a force that was trying to empty a room into the void, and she put the tech through the outer pressure door with the first one, and she turned again into the storm for the other two. The third she caught out of the air itself, a body already lifted off the deck, already tumbling toward the wound at the speed of the fleeing air, and Ren read its arc the way she read around, leaving an emitter, and put herself in the line of it, and took the tech out of the air with both arms and rode the impact down to the deck, and bled off the momentum in a long tearing slide that stripped the skin from her forearm and stopped, at last, with the tech clutched to her chest, 3 meters from the edge. She rolled the tech toward the corridor and shoved. The tech slid into the dead spot, 3. The fourth was the hardest, because the fourth was already gone. The fourth reconciliation tech had been closest to the wound when the flank opened, and the wind had taken the fourth first and fastest. And by the time Ren turned for the fourth, the tech was through the breach and out, tumbling in the dark beyond the torn hull with the stars wheeling past, a pale shape receding into the volume where no catch could reach. Ren stood at the edge of the wound with the wind streaming past her and the vacuum a step away, and she read the arc of the tumbling body, and she read her own speed, and she did the arithmetic cold at the lip of the dark, and the arithmetic said, if she went out after the fourth she might reach the tech, and she might not, and if she reached the tech she had no way to bring them both back against the vacuum with no purchase and no air, and the likeliest outcome of going out was 2 bodies in the dark instead of 1, and the child at the console and the 3 techs in the dead spot, and the prime at the mouth of the deck, all still needed the wound closed, and a body that goes out after the one it cannot save leaves the many it can. Her grandmother's flat voice in the flood 15 years ago, you next, then you, reading the water, never going in after the one already gone because the door still had people behind it. Ren did not go out after the fourth. She stood at the edge for the thinnest slice of a second and let the tech go into the dark, and she filed it, and she set it on the ledger where it would stay for the rest of her life, parallel and tidy and never once forgiven. And then she turned her back on the wound and went to close the deck, because that was the arithmetic, and the arithmetic did not care what it cost her to obey it. The outflow was slackening, the lowest deck had nearly emptied, and what air remained was thinning toward the pressure at which a veyd could no longer breathe, and at which even a deathworlder had a short and shrinking budget of consciousness. Ren felt the edges of her own vision begin to narrow, the specific gray closing in of a body running out of air, and she did the last of the arithmetic on a failing brain and moved. The prime first. Vale had gone to his knees at the mouth of the deck when the air left, 4 hands scrabbling at a deck cleat, his soft body not built for this, his breathing gone to a thin, whistling nothing. Ren reached him and got him up under the arms and moved him, not to the reconciliation corridor. That was too far now, and the wind still ran that way. But to the near thing, the surgical theater's outer seal, the door that stood between the lowest deck and the approach up to the vault. She put the prime through it. She put herself through it after him, into the theater's held air, and she turned in the doorway and looked back across the emptying deck at the reconciliation corridor, at the outer pressure door standing open, at the 3 techs in the dead spot, and the child at the console. All of them behind the outer door but not yet sealed, the inner door shut but the outer door open, the airlock length holding air only because the outflow had nearly stopped. And she understood that the moment the ward's automatic systems registered the breach they would try to seal the whole deck, and that when they sealed the deck they would close the outer pressure door of the reconciliation corridor, and that when the outer door closed with the inner door already shut, the 4 people inside the airlock length would be sealed into the one chamber on the ward that vented, on its own dedicated loop, directly to the outer hull. She had put them in the safest place on the deck, and the safest place on the deck was about to become the reconciliation room, sealed, on a station that had just learned it had a breach and would purge the breached deck to save the rest. The override was inside the corridor, between the two doors on the console, beside the child. Ren looked at the Prime, gasping on the floor of the theater, alive. She looked at the sealed theater door that stood between her and the near-safe air. She looked back across the emptying deck at the reconciliation corridor, and the 4 people in it and the outer door that had not yet closed but was going to. And she did the arithmetic one final time, and it came out the way it always came out with her, and she stepped back out of the theater's held air, onto the emptying deck, into the thinning nothing, with her vision graying and her budget of consciousness measured now in single breaths, and she went for the corridor. She crossed the emptied deck in the last of the outflow, and she came through the outer pressure door into the reconciliation corridor's airlock length at the exact instant the ward's automatic systems, having finally believed their own sensors, ordered the breached deck sealed. The outer pressure door began to close behind her. Ren read it, the heavy slab starting its slide, the seam narrowing, the mechanism committed, and she did not try to hold it, because holding it did nothing. A body cannot argue with a pressure door, and the ward wanted this door shut, and it was right to want it shut, because the deck beyond it was open to the dark. She let it close. She came through the last of the gap as it sealed, into the airlock length, and the outer door met its frame behind her with a sound she felt in her teeth. And then she was inside the one chamber on the ward that vented on its own dedicated loop to the outer hull, with the outer door sealed, and the inner door sealed, and 4 people, and a failing budget of air, and a console on the wall at the midpoint, with an override that the whole quiet horror of the ward's lowest deck had been built around. The child was at the console. Ren reached it in the time it took the 3 rescued techs to turn their heads. She had asked Kesser 11 days ago exactly how the reconciliation was done, and Kesser had told her, and the telling had lodged in Ren's ledger the way everything lodged now, complete and retrievable. The room vented to the outer hull. The room was on a dedicated environmental loop, and the override on the console, the safety measure that required an operator to be physically present inside the airlock length before a cycle could be forced. The override could force a vent, or it could refuse one. It was built so that no one outside the corridor could ever purge the chamber by accident, which meant that someone inside the corridor at the console could refuse the purge that the ward, having sealed a breached deck, was about to send to every chamber on that deck that vented to the hull, including this one. Ren put her hand on the override and read the veyd script on it the way she had learned to read everything, from the tells and the shape and the logic, and she found the toggle that mattered, the one that severed this chamber's vent from the deck's automatic purge, and she held it. The ward sent the purge. Ren felt it come down the loop, the demand to open this chamber to the hull, to add its air to the vacuum to make it clean. She held the override against it. The console argued with her impatient veyd script, insisting that an operator was forcing a refusal of a safety cycle, requesting confirmation, and Ren confirmed it. And the vent that would have emptied the reconciliation room did not open, and the airlock length kept its air thin, dwindling, but its own, sealed away from the dark on both sides, and 4 people who should have been purged with the deck went on breathing. Then she picked the child up. Ilo weighed almost nothing, a hollow-boned renewed child, feathers and fright, 6 years old and utterly silent, staring at the small blood-streaked human who had come out of the storm and put 4 grown veyd through a doorway, and now held him against the torn wreck of her own shoulder with a care that did not match anything else about the last 2 minutes. Ren held him the way her grandmother had held the youngest through the window last, after all the others, because the youngest could not hold on for themselves and had to be carried, and she sat down against the console with the child in her arms and the 3 techs staring at her from the far end of the airlock length, and she breathed the thin remaining air slowly, on a strict economy, and she waited for the ward to come and repressurize the deck, because that was the last of the arithmetic. And the arithmetic said the ward would want its lowest deck back, and to get it back they would have to open this chamber. And when they opened it, there would be 5 people alive inside it who should, by every procedure the ward possessed, be dead. "You are the article," one of the texts said. "The reconciliation section, the ones who did not eat with the rest, the ones whose quiet work had a drain in the floor. You caught us, you pulled us off the edge. We are the section that you know what we are, what this room is, you know what we do here." The glassy eyes were fixed on her, uncomprehending. "Why would you come into the storm for us? Of all the people on this ward, us?" Wren looked at the tech over the top of the child's feathered head. "Because you were on the shot line," she said. "That's all it ever is. You were on the shot line and I could reach you, and reaching you cost less than not reaching you. What you do in this room didn't come into it. I don't catch for people because they're good. I catch for people because they're catchable. If I only caught for the ones who deserved it, I'd have to be the kind of thing that decides who deserves it, and I'd rather be fast than be that." She shifted the child, easing the weight off the torn shoulder. "You can spend the rest of your quiet life deciding whether you deserved catching. That's yours to carry, not mine. I've got a full ledger already." The tech had no answer. None of them did. They sat in the thin, dwindling air at the far end of the disposal room they served, saved by the merchandise, and they were silent, and the child breathed against Wren's chest, and up through the sealed pressure doors, faintly, came the sounds of the ward beginning to fight for its own survival. The distant thud of emergency bulkheads, the groan of the wounded flank, the long labor of a station that had nearly died and had not quite, and did not yet know why. They repressurized the lowest deck 400 seconds later. Wren knew it was 400 seconds because she counted them, on the strict economy of the thin air, the child's breath and the prayer of the numbers keeping her conscious as the budget ran down. She felt the deck beyond the outer door fill, the pressure climbing back, the loop restoring, the wound sealed behind emergency plating that would hold until the ward could dock a proper repair tender. And when the deck beyond the door had air again, the ward tried to open the reconciliation corridor, and could not, because the override was still held, and a console somewhere up in environmental section registered that the disposal chamber on the breached deck had refused its purge cycle and was still, impossibly, pressurized with 5 life signs inside it, and a great confusion began to move through the ward. Wren released the override. She let the outer door cycle, and when it slid open at last, into the restored air of the salvaged deck, the first thing she saw through it was Prime Asan Vale, on his feet again, his soft gray body streaked with the burst capillaries of a creature that had nearly asphyxiated, standing in the mouth of the corridor with all 4 hands unfolded and hanging open at his sides, in a posture she had never seen a veyd hold, the posture, she understood, of a being who had run entirely out of the gestures his people had for what was in front of him. Behind him stood Broker Sevik of the Ashen, and behind Sevik stood the 2 heavy soldiers with their long weapons, and behind them a crowd of ward staff and Ashen medical section, all of them stopped, all of them staring into the disposal corridor at the small blood-streaked human sitting against the console with a renewed child asleep in her arms, and 3 of the ward's own executioners alive at her feet. For a long moment no one in the corridor or the crowd made a sound. Then Wren stood up slowly, the torn shoulder and the broken hand and the stripped forearm all reporting at once now that the arithmetic no longer needed her to ignore them, and she carried the sleeping child out of the reconciliation room, past the prime, past the broker, past the long weapons, and no one moved to stop her, because there was not one being in that corridor who any longer believed that stopping her was a thing that could be done. She stopped in front of Vale. She looked up at him, a full head and more up, the way she had looked up at all of them for 70 days. "The clamp's sealed," she said in the flat gauge-reading voice. "The deck's got air. You lost one of your reconciliation techs out the breach. I couldn't reach the 4th without losing more, and I made that call at the edge and I'll carry it, so don't. Everyone else on this deck is alive. The child is asleep. He ran out of frightened about 90 seconds ago, which is what small things do when they finally decide someone's got them. I'm going to put him somewhere warm. And then you and I are going to have the conversation you've been not having in your vault for 3 weeks, Prime, the one where you ask what it wants, out loud to my face, and I answer it. We've both earned that conversation. Everybody in this corridor has. So find us a room with air in it and let's have it. They found a room with air in it. It was an observation gallery 2 decks up, undamaged, with a long curved window that looked out on the wounded flank of the ward and the emergency plating over the breach, and beyond it, the Ocean tender still mated to its overtaxed gantry, quiescent now, its clamp shored with hastily welded bracing. The system star burned white and cold through the window and lay across the gallery floor in a long, clean bar of light. Wren sat in it. She had left the child with Kessler. The junior physician had come at a run when the ward's confusion broke open, and Wren had put Ilo into 4 careful hands and said nothing about the corridor, because saying nothing was the whole of the protection she had promised, and Kessler had understood and had carried the child away warm. That was one number settled. Kessler had put the child in the corridor and walked away and done nothing, exactly as agreed, and when they questioned the junior physician afterward, the answers would be true because they were true, and a physician who had done nothing could not be salvaged for it. Wren had built the plan that way on purpose, 11 days ago in the dark. She had not been able to save the weeping woman. She had been able to make sure that the one veyd who had spent a middle of cycle on her did not end in a room with a drain. It was a small balancing. She took it. Now she sat in the bar of cold light with Veil across from her, and Sevik standing at the window with his back to the breach, and the 2 heavy Ocean by the door, and she waited for the Prime to ask the question, because she had told him he would have to ask it, and she meant to make him. "What does it want?" Veil said. Then, with an effort she watched cost him something, he corrected the pronoun, and it was the correcting that told her he had truly gotten the frame at last. "What do you want?" Wren Ashby of the Halcyon Drift, attrition grade 9. I have measured you for 70 days and I have not once asked, because my trade taught me that the question does not apply to an article, and my trade was wrong, and I am asking it now. "What do you want?" "I already told you in the surgical corridor when you thought you were about to cut it out of me," Wren said. "I want the child not reconciled. That was the whole want 3 weeks ago. But the arithmetic's bigger now, because the room's bigger. Everybody in this gallery watched what happened on that deck, and you can't unwatch it, so the numbers I can ask for went up. So I'll give you the whole list, and then you'll tell me which parts you can move, and we'll find the place where the shot lines cross, the way people do when they've stopped pretending one of them is merchandise." She held up her good hand and counted, the way her grandmother had counted people through a window. "The child goes free. Home, if his world will take him back. Somewhere warm if it won't. The 14 people still in the compliance tier come off the salvage schedule and off the sales schedule both. No more tuning, no more buyers, no more reconciliation for the ones the graft didn't take. And this ward stops. Not stops selling to the Ocean. Stops. No more transit holds, no more salvage lots off the sundering worlds, no more tables. That's the list." "That list ends my ward," Veil said. "Yes. It ends a trade 9,000 years old. My caste has survived among harder peoples for 90 centuries by being the ones who could take a dangerous thing and make it hold still. You are asking me to set down the only craft that ever kept us alive." "I'm asking you to set down a craft that was already killing you," Wren said. "You just couldn't feel it, because it killed you slowly and it killed other people fast, and slow deaths are easy to mistake for a life. Your craft put a supersonic reflex into a 19-year-old, and then bet a fortune that the reflex would do what it was pointed at, and it was wrong, and the only reason you're breathing right now is that it was wrong. If I'd been the weapon you built me to be, Prime, if you'd gotten the compliant article you were an hour from cutting me into, that thing would have caught the round meant for whoever held its pointer, and it would have let your breach kill you, because a hand that only catches what it's pointed at wasn't pointed at your clamp. Your whole trade is built on making things that can't save you. You've been proud of that for 90 centuries. I'm telling you it's the flaw, and I'm the ward's own instrument telling you, and if you had any of the seeing left you'd hear it. The gallery was quiet. The star burned. On the far side of the window, the wounded flank of the ward creaked in the cold. And Broker Sevik of the Ocean, at the window, with his back to the breach and his arterial slit fixed on the small human in the bar of light, said the thing that changed the arithmetic one final time. "I will pay for it," Sevik said. Vale turned. Ren did not. She had heard the shape of it coming the way she heard a coil. "My principals sent me to buy a servant that catches," Sevik said. "I watched a servant that catches take 4 of your executioners off the edge of a breach and carry your worst room's condemned child out of the disposal chamber and hold your own purge cycle off it with the override you built to kill. I have sold violence for 400 years prime, and I have made a great many servants that stand behind the chairs of frightened magnates, and I have watched, as I told the article, 3 of my principals die because no servant downrange would say where the shot line ran. And I understand now, standing at your broken window, that I have had the trade backward my entire life, and so have you, and so has every soft, frightened people in the surveyed volume who ever tried to buy safety by holding the leash of something more dangerous than its neighbor. Safety was never in the leash. The leashed thing only ever catches what it is pointed at. What we all wanted, what my dying principals wanted in the last instant, when the knife came from the angle no one had pointed the servant at, was the thing your ward accidentally grew and was 1 hour from cutting out. A creature that catches for the room, not for the pointer, for the room. The slit brightened. "So I will pay for the list," Sevik said. "The child, the tear, the closing of the ward, I will fund all of it, out of the fortune I flew here to spend on a leash, because I have decided I would rather spend it on the one true thing I have seen in 4 centuries than carry it home and buy another servant that lets its principal die at the wrong angle. And in exchange, I want nothing that can be owned. I want only what the article already gives away for free, to executioners and strangers and the physicians who were about to gut it. I want to have stood in the room where the deathworlders turned out to be the thing that catches for everyone, so that when my people ask me why I came home with an empty hold, I can tell them the truth, which is that I finally met the merchandise, and the merchandise was never the weapon we were afraid of. It was the medic we should have been begging for." Ren looked at the broker for a long moment. "That's a lot of words," she said, "for a man who came here to buy a knife. But I've read enough shot lines to know a true one from a closing one, and that was true, so I'll take it. The child, the tear, the ward, funded. Nobody owns anything." She turned back to Vale. "That's your out prime. The Ocean will pay for the end of your trade so you don't have to choose between your cast's craft and the 14 people in your tier. It's a soft landing. Softer than you gave the weeping woman across the corridor from me, who budgeted her grief 1 hour a day for 63 days and then didn't get a soft landing at all, because your ward reconciled her for the crime of not taking the graft. So before you thank the broker for buying you a gentle way to close, I want you to sit with the fact that a stranger from a people you've traded knives with for 400 years found more mercy in 1 afternoon than your whole merciful scholarly caste found in 9,000 years. And then I want you to say yes, out loud to the list, so it's real and you chose it. The same way I made Kessler say the price out loud. The same way you should have made yourself say it every single day you ran this ward and didn't." Vale was silent for a long time. He looked at the small human in the bar of cold light, bloodied, torn, one hand broken, sitting perfectly still with her hands open in her lap in the posture he had once mistaken for a servant's patience, and now understood to be the stillness of a thing that has finished the equation and is only waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. He looked at the broker who had come to buy a weapon and stayed to fund a mercy. He looked past them both, through the long window at the wound in the flank of his ward, sealed now behind emergency plating. A wound that would have been his tomb and the tomb of everyone on the lowest deck if the thing he had spent 9 weeks trying to leash had done what he built it to do instead of what it was. Yes, Prime Asen Vale said, out loud in the gallery in front of the broker and the soldiers and the star. Yes, to all of it. The child goes free. The tier comes off every schedule. The ward closes. His 4 hands came up and folded, and then, deliberately, the way a man sets down a tool he has carried so long his hand has grown around it, unfolded again, and hung open at his sides. I have run this ward for 30 years. I told myself, every one of those years, that I was not a cruel man, and by the standards of my caste it was even true, and I understand now that the standards of my caste were the cruelty, and that I mistook the water I was drowning in for air because I had never once been dry. You said I had started doing the seeing. I had not really, not until the deck opened and I lay on it unable to breathe and watch the merchandise choose, against every number I had measured, to spend its one freedom pulling my executioners off a blade. That was the seeing. It came 30 years too late for a great many people, and 1 hour too late to be anything I can be proud of, but it came. The glassy eyes fixed on her. What do I do with it, Wren Ashby, now that I can see? You have counted further ahead than anyone in this gallery for 70 days. Count for me. What does a man do with the seeing when it comes to him 30 years late and drenched in everything he did before it? You want me to tell you how to feel better, Wren said. I can't. There isn't a number for that, and I don't carry things I can't count. What I can tell you is what to do, which is smaller and harder and the only thing that's ever actually helped anybody. She stood slow, the torn shoulder pulling. You go down to the tier and you open the 14 doors yourself with your own 4 hands, and you say the thing out loud to each of them that you just said to me, not because it fixes anything. It doesn't. But those 14 people have spent every day for 2 months hearing that door seal and never once hearing why. And the least a man who's finally learned to see can do is stand in front of the people he couldn't see and let them look at him while he says it. You'll want to send a med tech to do the opening. Don't. You want the seeing to mean something. It costs you the 14 conversations in person, however they go, including the ones that go badly, and some of them will go very badly, and you'll stand there and take it, because taking it is the whole of what you have to offer now. That's what a man does with the seeing when it comes late. He pays the freight on it in person. Everything else is just a nicer word for the vault you hid in. Vale was quiet. Then he inclined his head, not the formal incline of a host, but something lower, something his caste did not have a name for either. Come with me, he said. When I open the doors, they will not believe it from me. They have no reason to, but they know your voice through the walls. They have set their days by you the way you set yours by the man who prays. If you stand in the corridor while I open the doors, they will believe the doors are real. I am asking you for that. It is the last thing this ward will ever ask of you, and I am aware I have no standing to ask it. Wren looked at him for a moment. All right, she said, but you open them. I'll stand where they can see me. I won't say anything. This is your freight, not mine. I just make it real. They went down to the tier. Vale opened the 14 doors himself, one at a time with his own 4 hands, and Wren stood in the curve of the white corridor where the 14 could see her, small, bloodied, torn, ordinary. And she said nothing. And she watched the ward's prime stand in each doorway and say the thing out loud. And she watched the 14 conversations, and some of them went very badly. The man who prayed did not stop praying when his door opened. He finished the 9 phrases, all 9, in the language no one on the ward had ever identified, and only then did he look up at the pale gray creature in his doorway. And he did not say anything at all, and the not saying was worse than any shouting. And Vale stood in it and took it, exactly as he had been told, and did not send a med tech and did not leave, until the man had finished looking at him and turned his face to the wall. There was a woman who wept, not the woman across from Wren's cell. That woman was gone, purged, 63 days of rationed grief poured out into a room with a drain, but another farther down, who wept when the door opened, not from grief, but from the specific animal shock of a body that had stopped believing the door was a thing that opened outward. There was a man who tried to strike the prime, and Veil let him, and took the blow across the face with his soft, translucent hands hanging open at his sides, and did not defend himself, and Ren watched and did not intervene, because the blow was owed and stepping into an owed blow was a thing that did nothing. And there were some, near the end, who simply walked out of their cells and stood in the corridor and looked at Ren, because they knew her voice, because they had set their days by the small, rough voice that carried through the walls, and they understood, in the way that people who have survived a failing place understand things, that whatever had happened on the lowest deck, the reason their doors were open was standing in the curve of the corridor covered in her own blood, saying nothing, and they did not thank her. Because she was not the kind of thing you thanked, any more than you thanked the person who stood in the door of the flood and read the water. You just went through the window they held, and you carried the youngest, and you remembered. Ilo went home. It took 40 days to arrange, because a renewed child swept up by a manifest error is a difficult thing to return, and because the ward, in closing, had a great deal of undoing to do, and because Ren insisted on confirming personally, through Kesser and the Oceans-funded channels, that the world the child was being returned to was the world the child had come from, and that there was someone on it who would take him. There was. A renewed settlement in a low-gravity habitat 3 transits out, and in it, a household that had reported a child lost to a salvage raid 71 days before and had stopped, by then, expecting to hear anything but the worst. Ren did not go with him to the habitat. She sent Kesser, because Kesser had put the child in the corridor and walked away and carried him out warm and had earned the other end of it, the good end, the end where you hand the youngest back through the window to the people who were waiting. But Ren was on the dock when the transport took Ilo out, and the child, who had run out of frightened in a disposal room 40 days before, and had not since entirely gone back to being a small silent thing, broke away from the medtech guiding him and ran back across the dock on his hollow bones and put his feathered arms as far around Ren as they would reach, which was not far, and held on. Ren crouched down to the child's height, the way you have to with the youngest, and let him hold on for exactly as long as he needed, which was longer than a busy dock had time for and precisely as long as it took, and she did not hurry him, because hurrying the youngest was the one thing her grandmother had never once done, not even in the flood, not even at the end. And then she said something to him low, that no one else on the dock heard, and the child let go and went home. "What did you tell him?" Kesser asked later on the observation dock, watching the transport's light diminish toward the transit lane. "At the end, when he let go." "I told him the truth," Ren said. "That being caught once doesn't mean somebody's always going to be there to catch you. That most of the time you catch yourself, and the world's mostly people falling and no one fast enough, and that's just the arithmetic and it doesn't make anybody bad. And then I told him the other true thing, which is that being caught once, even once, is enough to know it's a thing that can happen, and that knowing it's a thing that can happen is most of what lets a person become the kind of thing that does it for someone else. That's the whole of it. You get caught once, and if you're lucky it teaches you how, and then you spend the rest of it standing indoors." She was quiet a moment. "He'll forget the words, he was 6, but he'll keep the shape of it. The youngest always keep the shape." Kesser was silent for a while. "You could have gone home," the junior physician said finally. "In the settlement when they were arranging the child's return there was a berth to the halcyon drift. I saw it on the manifest. You saw it too. You see everything. You could have been on it. Instead you stayed 40 days to confirm a renewed child's household and to stand on a dock and let him hold on. Why did you not take the berth home, Ren?" Ren watched the diminishing light. "Because I can't go home," she said, without any heat in it, the flat gauge-reading voice. "Not the way you mean. The graft doesn't come out. Your own prime confirmed it. There's no unaugmenting, there's only this forever, the seeing that runs ahead of the light and the hands that catch what moves faster than sound. I could stand in a doorway on the Halcyon Drift, but the doorway would be small, and the floods would be small, and most of the time I'd stand in a room full of ordinary people going ordinary speeds, and I'd be the strange, fast, quiet thing in the corner that everyone learned not to look at directly. That's not a home. That's just a different cell with better light. She turned from the window. So I'm doing the arithmetic on what a person does when they've been made into a thing that catches and can't be unmade, and doesn't want to be a weapon and can't go back to being ordinary. And the arithmetic keeps coming out the same, the way it always does with me. There are a lot of failing places out there, Kesser. A lot of floods. A lot of doorways with no one fast enough standing in them. Your cast made me to be the last thing in the room. Fine. I'll be the last thing in the room. I'll just be the last thing in the room for the people falling instead of the people holding the pointer. That's the only change I'm making to the design. Everything else they built right. They just never once asked what it was for. Broker Sevik left Vest deep on the day the last of the Tiers 14 were cleared for transit home, and before he went, he came to find Ren on the observation dock, alone, without his soldiers. "My principals will not understand the empty hold," he said. His matte charcoal shell caught the cold light of the star. "I have run the accounting a dozen ways, and there is no version of it that reads, to an Ashen ledger, as anything but a broker who flew to the edge of the surveyed volume, spent a fortune, and came home with nothing to stand behind their chairs. They will think I have gone soft. Some of them will think worse. It is possible I have brokered my last acquisition." The arterial slit fixed on her. "And I find, Article Ren, that I do not much care, and that the not caring is the strangest thing that has happened to me in 400 years, stranger than the breach, stranger than watching you walk the second tech back against the wind. I have spent my life afraid of your kind. My whole people have. We built an entire trade out of the fear, buy the deathworlder, tune the deathworlder, point the deathworlder at whatever we are afraid of and pray the leash holds. And I understand now that we were afraid of exactly the wrong thing. We were afraid you were weapons. We should have been afraid you were witnesses." "Witnesses," Ren said. "You watch," Sevik said. "That is the thing none of the files caught in 400 years of files. You do not miss things, the way my confirmer said, but it is not the missing nothing of a targeting system. It is the missing nothing of a creature that has decided, at some level below choosing, that being in a room means being responsible for the room. You walked onto my demonstration a piece of restrained merchandise, and you spent the entire time keeping people alive, including people who had done nothing for you, including me, and you never once made a speech about it or asked to be thanked for it or used it to bargain. You did it the way water runs downhill, because it was simply what you were in a room being responsible for the room. My people cannot make a servant that does that. No one can make it. It is not in the graft. It is in the 10,000 generations of standing in doorways, and it cannot be bought, and it cannot be leashed, and it cannot be pointed. And the galaxy has spent an age trying to do all three because it could not bear the simpler and more frightening truth." "Which is what?" Ren said. "The most dangerous thing your worlds produce is also the safest thing to be in a room with," Sevik said, "and that we could have had that safety freely for the asking at any point in 400 years if we had been willing to stop trying to own it and simply let it be what it is. We were not willing. We are a frightened people, and a frightened people would rather hold a leash it cannot trust than accept a gift it cannot control." The slit dimmed. "I am going to go home and tell them that. All of it. I expect it will end me, as a broker and possibly otherwise. But I have watched the one true thing, and a man who has watched the one true thing and goes home and sells the old lie anyway is a man who deserves what the lie brings. So I will tell them the truth and let it bring what it brings. You taught me that on the first day in the demonstration chamber. Someone should say where the shot line runs, even when, especially when, no one wants to hear it." He turned to go, At the airlock he stopped. "There will be others," Sevik said. "Other wards, other buyers. My people are not the only frightened people, and the veyd are not the only leash crafters, and the salvage lots will keep lifting off your sundering worlds long after this one ward closes, because fear is patient and fear is old, and one afternoon on one broken station does not undo an age of it. You know this. You have already counted it, I can see you have. So I will tell you the one useful thing I have left to give, and then I will go and lose my fortune telling the truth. The funding I have committed to closing this ward, I have structured it so that it does not end when the ward ends. It continues. It goes to whatever you decide to build with it, wherever you decide to stand. I do not know what that will be. Neither, I think, do you, yet. But when the failing places call, and they will call, article, the whole surveyed volume is full of failing places and doorways with no one fast enough. You will not have to answer them empty-handed. Consider it the price of the education. Consider us at last even." And broker Sevik of the Ocean went home to lose everything telling the truth, which was, Ren thought, watching his tender unmate at last from the shored gantry, a more human thing to do than most humans ever managed, and she filed it, and she did not correct him about the even, because some ledgers you let a person believe are balanced when the balancing was the whole of what they had to give. The veyd came for veil, in the end, the way institutions come for the ones who break their trades from inside. An oversight tribunal convened 40 transits out, in the cast's own halls, and Prime Asan Veil was recalled to answer for the closing of a profitable ward, the loss of an article worth a fortune, the release of 14 tuned assets, the funding of that release with the very payment that should have crossed the cast's ledgers, the whole catalogue of a man who had taken his ward's side against the ward. Ren was not called. She was not in the tribunal's frame a party to anything. She was the lost article, the missing merchandise, a line item that had walked off the books. But Kesser followed the proceedings through the cast's open channels and reported them back, and the reports were, for a long stretch, exactly as grim as the reconciliation section's quiet room. And then they were not. Because Veil, standing in front of his own cast's tribunal, did the thing Ren had told him to do in the gallery, he paid the freight in person. He did not defend the closing on the ledgers, because it could not be defended on the ledgers. He described the deck opening. He described lying on it unable to breathe, watching the merchandise choose. He described the second tech walked back against the wind, and the child carried out of the disposal chamber, and the override held against the purge, and he described, to a room full of the finest leash crafters in the surveyed volume, the exact moment he had understood that his entire trade was built on making things that could not save him, and that he had been proud of it for 30 years, and that the pride was the cruelty, and that he had mistaken the water for air because he had never once been dry. He did not ask the tribunal for mercy. He asked them instead, and Kesser said the channel went very quiet when he did, to convene not a tribunal but an inquiry, not into what he had done, into what they all were, into a trade that had spent 9,000 years buying safety it could never trust, from a people it had never once thought to simply ask, and into the possibility, which he laid in front of them like a body on a table, that the entire craft of his caste had been a 9,000-year flinch away from the one thing that could actually have kept them safe, which was not a leashed weapon but an unleashed witness, freely given, if they had ever been brave enough to receive it. The tribunal did not close Veil's ward as a punishment. It could not. The ward was already closed. What it did, after a long recess and a longer argument, was stranger and slower and more consequential. It left the question open. It did not rule that Veil was right. It did not rule that he was wrong. It ruled that the question he had laid on the table was a real question, and that a caste 9,000 years old could survive asking it, and it convened the inquiry he had asked for, and named him to it, not as a defendant and not as a hero, but as the one physician who had seen the thing from the inside and lived to describe it. It was not justice. Ren, when Kesser reported it, said it was not justice and was not meant to be, and that justice was a thing people wanted when they were done counting and had decided to feel something instead, and that what the tribunal had done was better than justice, because justice ends and a question does not, and a question laid in the right place could go on doing work in a room for 100 years after the person who asked it was gone. He wanted you to know, Kessler said, that he did it the way you told him, in person. He paid the freight. A pause. He also wanted you to know one more thing, and he made me promise to say it in his words, so I will. He said, tell her the seeing came 30 years late and drenched, and it will never come clean, and I would not trade it back for anything, because a man who has finally been dry would rather stand cold and dry for 1 year than drown warm for another 30. He said you would understand it. I do not entirely, but he said you would. I understand it, Wren said. She built the thing slowly over the months that followed, the way she did everything from the tells, from the pressures, from the arithmetic, one balanced number at a time. Sevic's funding was real and it kept coming, structured exactly as he had promised, arriving through the Ocean's quiet channels long after the broker himself had gone home to lose his standing telling the truth. Kessler stayed, because Kessler had nowhere in the cast to go back to and no wish to go, and because a physician who had learned to do the seeing was worth more standing beside Wren than anywhere the old trade could have placed her. And between the two of them and the funding, and the long list of failing places that Wren had begun to keep the way she kept every ledger, parallel, tidy, retrievable, a shape came clear that was not a ward and not a fleet and not a weapon, and had no name in any of the catalogs, because the catalogs had never needed one. It was not large. That was the first thing Wren decided, and she decided it against Kessler's instinct, which was to build something the size of the problem. The problem was the size of the surveyed volume. You did not build something the size of that. You built something the size of a doorway, and you put it where the water was rising, and you read the flood, and you put the others through the window in the order the water demanded, and not the order anyone's fear wanted. One doorway at a time. One room you were responsible for because you were in it. The rest was arithmetic, and arithmetic did not care how large the problem was. It only cared what you could reach. So they went to the failing places. Not the great ones. Not the fleets and the councils and the wars, which had their own machinery and their own witnesses, and did not need a small, fast, quiet thing in the corner. The other ones. The salvage lots lifting off the sundering worlds with their manifests full of attrition-grade biologicals. The transit holds. The quiet wards on quiet stations where soft, frightened peoples were still trying, in the old patient way, to buy safety by tuning something more dangerous than their neighbors. Wren went to those places, with Kessler and a med kit and no weapon at all, and she stood in the doorways, and she read the shot lines, and she said the thing no one downrange would say, and when the failing thing failed, and it always, eventually, failed because that was what failing things did, she was the last thing in the room for the people falling. The first of them, the one that taught her the shape of the work, was a grain elevator on a border world called HumanVsAliens, where a cephalopod people the color of wet slate had built their whole economy around a single vast pressurized silo, and had been, for 2 generations, quietly buying tuned deathworlders from a broker 2 systems over to work the silo's most dangerous decks. Because a tuned deathworlder could survive the pressure changes that killed an ordinary worker, and could be replaced without paperwork when it didn't. Wren went to HumanVsAliens because the manifest of a salvage lot had crossed one of Kessler's channels, and she went with the med kit and no weapon, and she stood on the silo's loading dock in the flat gray light of a border star and read, in the first unhurried instant, the thing the silo's owners had spent 2 generations not letting themselves read, that the pressure vessel was failing. It was an old failure, a slow one, the kind that announces itself for years to anyone willing to hear it, and to no one who profits from not hearing. The silo's main pressure seam had been weeping for a decade, and the owners had been welding over the weep, and re-rating the vessel downward on paper and putting tuned deathworlders on the deck nearest the seam because tuned deathworlders survived what killed ordinary workers, and the whole arrangement had held, the way a clamp holds a ship it was not rated for. Right up until the afternoon, Wren Ashby stood on the loading dock and heard the seam begin, at last, to let go. She did not argue with the owner, a broad slate-gray manager who met her at the dock, with the wary courtesy that border worlds show to strangers who arrive off no scheduled transit. She said, in the flat gauge-reading voice, that the main seam was failing, that it had been failing for a decade, that it would let go within the day, and that when it did, the whole pressurized volume of the silo would try to empty itself through the seam at once and take the near decks with it, and that there were, by her count of the shift boards on the dock wall, 11 workers on those near decks. 9 of them tuned deathworlders bought off a broker, and 2 of them slate-gray locals who had drawn the short shift. She said it the way she said everything, without heat, as information, and the manager did what frightened people who profit from not hearing always do first, which was to explain to her why she was wrong. She let the manager finish, then the seam let go. It let go the way the clamp had let go on Vest Deep, a long rising shriek climbing into a register that made the slate-gray manager clutch at the dock rail. And Wren was already moving, off the loading dock and down into the silo, against the rising wind of a pressurized volume beginning to empty itself, toward the near decks and the 11 people on them. The physics of a failing pressure vessel are not the physics of a hull breach, but they are cousins, and the cousinship is unkind. Where a breach pulls everything toward the wound, a failing silo threw everything away from the seam first, a wall of overpressured atmosphere and loose grain and torn plating moving out from the failure faster than sound, and the 11 workers on the near decks were caught between the seam behind them and the choke points of the deck exits ahead, in the path of a supersonic wall of everything the silo had been holding. Wren reached the first choke point ahead of the wall. She had read the geometry coming down the axis, where the workers would run, where they would bottleneck, where the wall would reach them, and she put herself at the bottleneck, in the one place where the 11 fleeing bodies would funnel down to a width she could stand across, and when the first of them came through, a tuned deathworlder like herself, a lean, dark-skinned man with a graph scar at the base of his skull and no idea who she was. She took him by the arm and swung him through the choke, and down the far access into the dead ground beyond it, and reached back for the next, and the next, reading each body's arc and speed, and putting each one through the gap in the order the failing silo demanded, and not the order their panic wanted. The way her grandmother had put 9 people through a window in the order the flood demanded. 9 of them she put through before the wall arrived. The 2 slowest were the slate-gray locals, soft-bodied, unaugmented, born to this gravity but not to this speed, and they were still short of the choke when the supersonic wall came down the deck behind them, a rolling front of overpressure and grain, and a spinning length of torn plating riding the crest of it like a blade. Wren read the plating, read its arc the way she read a round leaving an emitter, and understood that it would reach the 2 locals a full second before they reached the choke, and that a spinning length of silo plating moving faster than sound through 2 soft-bodied people was not a thing anyone survived, and that she had, as always, exactly 1 slice of a second to spend, and could not spend it in 2 places. She spent it on the plating. She left the choke point and went into the wall itself, into the part of the failing silo where a body should not have been able to move at all, and she met the spinning plate a hand's width from the nearer local's back and caught it, took the whole screaming momentum of it into her healed stiff hand and her twice-torn shoulder, and set her feet against a deck cleat, and stopped a supersonic blade a hand's width from a soft gray spine, and the stopping tore her open in ways she filed and did not feel. And the 2 locals stumbled the last meters to the choke and through it, and into the dead ground, alive, and Wren stood in the wall with a length of torn plating locked in her grip, and the whole pressurized fury of Sunreach Talley's grain silo breaking against her, and she held. until the overpressure bled off through the widening seam, and the wind died and the deck, at last, went still. 11 workers in the dead ground. All 11. And the small, dirty, quiet woman who had walked onto the dock off no scheduled transit standing alone in the wreck of the near deck, with a plate of torn steel in her hands and blood running down from her shoulder at a steady, unhurried rate, setting the plate down, at last, against the ruined wall, parallel, tidy, the way a person tidies a fork. The slate-gray manager found her there. The manager had watched the whole of it from the loading dock, had watched a stranger he had spent 5 minutes explaining reality to walk into a failing pressure vessel and put 11 workers through a choke point and stop a supersonic blade with her body. And the manager stood in the wreck and looked at her the way Veyd had looked at her across the demonstration chamber, the way Sevik had looked at her at the broken window, the way the executioners of the reconciliation section had looked at her in the disposal room, the look of a being whose catalog had just run out of pages. "You said the seam was failing," the manager said. "I told you that you were wrong. I spent 5 minutes telling you that you were wrong, and while I told you the seam was failing exactly as you said, and my workers were on the near decks exactly as you said because I had put them there exactly as you said for exactly the reasons you said." The slate-gray face worked. "Why did you not simply let it happen? I would have deserved it. I had earned it, 2 generations of it. Why would you come down into the wall for workers I bought like grain, and a manager who called you a liar to your face, while the thing you warned him of was already killing his people?" Ren picked the med kit back up off the deck where she had dropped it. She had 11 people to check over and a shoulder to close, and no time for the conversation the manager needed to have. But she gave the manager the one sentence she gave all of them, because it was true and someone should say it. "Because you were in the room," she said. "And so was I, that's the whole of it. It was never about what you deserved. If I only caught for the ones who deserved it, I'd have to be the kind of thing that stands in a failing silo deciding who's earned the catching, and by the time I decided, the plate would have gone through your workers' backs. So I don't decide, I just catch. You can spend the next 2 generations deciding whether you earned it, that's yours to carry, and I'd start carrying it today if I were you. And I'd start by re-rating this silo honestly and buying no more workers like grain. But the deciding is your freight, not mine. I've got 11 people to check and a border star setting and a next failing place 4 transits out. Point me at your injured and stay out of the choke." She caught a great many things, in the years that followed, that moved faster than sound. She caught a coolant line that ruptured in a mining habitat and would have cut a work crew in half, caught the whipping end of it out of the air and rode it down, and pinned it while a frightened supervisor, who had never once said where the shot line ran, learned, in one afternoon, to say it. She caught a child off a collapsing gantry on a spaceport built by a people whose bones were too light for the gravity they had settled in, and handed the child back through the window to a parent who did not thank her, because she was not the kind of thing you thanked. She caught, once, a tribunal's decision going the wrong way in a room full of leashcrafters, not with her hands but with the flat gauge-reading voice, standing up in a place she had no standing to stand up in and saying where the shot line ran. And the decision changed, because a room that has one true witness in it decides differently than a room that has none. And that, in the end, was the thing Sevik had understood at the broken window and gone home to die telling. She did not become famous. That was the second thing she decided, and she enforced it harder than the first. A famous thing is a thing that can be pointed at, and Ren had spent 70 days as a thing that could be pointed at and had no intention of building it back on purpose. So she stayed small and dirty and ordinary and quiet, and she went where the water was rising, and the people she helped remembered her the way you remember the person who stood in the door of the flood, not by name, mostly, and not with monuments, but with the specific unrepayable weight of having gone through a window someone else held open, and having carried the youngest, because the youngest could not hold on for themselves. And the galaxy, slowly, in the patient way that large, old, frightened things change their minds, began to hear a different story about the deathworlders than the one the files had told for an age. Not that they were safe. They were not safe. Ren would have been the first to read that shot line aloud. A sundering world grinds out a hard creature, and a hard creature is a hard thing to be in a room with when the room turns against it. But the old story had been that the danger was the whole of them, that the thing to do with a creature from an attrition world was to leash it and point it and pray. And the new story, spreading transit by transit, station by station, in the wake of a small, quiet woman who kept turning up wherever the water was rising, was stranger and truer and much harder for a frightened people to swallow. That the danger and the safety were the same thing, that the creature the galaxy had spent an age trying to own was the creature that would, if you simply let it stand in the door, be the last thing between you and the dark. Not because you paid it, not because you leashed it, but because being in the room made it responsible for the room, and that responsibility ran downhill like water, whether you deserved it or not. Kessler asked her once, near the end of the third year, on a transit between one failing place and the next, whether she was ever going to stop, whether there was a number of doorways that would be enough, whether the ledger ever balanced. Ren was quiet for a while, watching the transit lane slide past, her broken hand long healed into a stiffness she carried the way she carried everything, filed and unfelt. "The ledger doesn't balance," she said. "That's not what it's for. I stopped thinking it balanced the day I let the fourth tech go into the dark, and I've carried that one every day since, parallel and tidy, and I'll carry it till I stop. You don't do this to balance a ledger. You do it because you were made into a thing that catches, and the only choice they left you was what to catch for, and you looked at the whole surveyed volume full of people falling and no one fast enough, and you did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic came out doorways." She turned from the window. "There's no number of doorways that's enough. There's just the next one. There's always a next one. That's not a sad thing, Kessler, though I know it sounds like one to you. It's the opposite of the sad thing. The sad thing would be being this fast, and this awake, and this responsible for every room I walk into, and having nowhere to put it, having nowhere to stand. They almost did that to me on a table, an hour from cutting out the part that stands indoors. Every doorway since is the part they didn't get to cut. So no, I'm not going to stop. There's a failing place 4 transits ahead of us right now, a quiet ward, a soft frightened people, a manifest full of attrition-grade biologicals, and somebody down there is going to seal a door tonight and never say why, and I'm going to go stand in the corridor where they can see me and make it real." The transit lane slid past. The star of the next failing place burned ahead, small and white and cold, growing. "They upgraded my neural speed," Ren Ashby said, mostly to herself, in the flat, quiet voice that never once rose, "so I could catch things moving faster than sound. They just never asked what I'd catch." She stood and picked up the med kit and went forward to read the shot lines of the place ahead, the way her grandmother had walked toward the flood, the way the ones a sundering world keeps have always walked toward the failing thing, not fast, though she was the fastest thing in the volume, not afraid, though there was plenty to fear, but level and awake and already counting, toward the next door that needed someone standing in it, and the next after that, for as long as the water kept rising and there were still people on the wrong side of the window. There were always people on the wrong side of the window, and now, at last, there was someone fast enough to reach them.